Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining this webinar on the certification for facilitating international trade of green hydrogen. So today's webinar will be organized in 3 sessions and will last between 9:30 and 1 p.m. Central European time. I would thank all participants if they could also rename themselves in the Zoom meeting and put their organization name as well, so that we can identify who is who. I also welcome all speakers to put their camera on. That being said, I now leave the floor to Kumiko Tamori, Deputy Director of the Environment Directorate at the OECD, for opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Joseph, and good morning, good afternoon, depending on from where you're joining us today. Welcome to this webinar on certification for facilitating international trade of green hydrogen. Now, as countries and companies turn from net zero pledges to their implementation, there has been growing interest in low carbon hydrogen as a cross-cutting energy vector that can help to decarbonize hard to abate sectors such as cement and steel, and also maritime shipping, freight transport, and power systems could benefit from low carbon hydrogen produced from clean feedstock. As part of OECD-wide work to address net zero transitions, different parts of the OECD are addressing low carbon hydrogen from different policy angles, including green innovation, finance and investment, international trade and value chains, industrial safety, etc., etc. Now, while it's not a silver bullet in our net zero journey, green hydrogen trade could unlock possibilities to establish global hydrogen value chain and provide opportunities for countries with low cost renewables to meet the hydrogen demands of countries that do not have their own resources. So one important OECD contribution in this context is a new working paper, Green Hydrogen Opportunities for Emerging and Developing Economies. This was released in the margins of COP27, and it was developed under OECD's Clean Energy Finance and Investment Mobilization Program, or what we call CEFIM program. This paper identifies key factors for building enabling conditions for hydrogen projects around the world. Applying the OECD's whole of government approach, we have been holding consultations with governments, broader stakeholder groups on the key issues to be overcome for the creation and growth of low carbon hydrogen markets. Through this work, we know that in order to ensure the sustainable supply and use of hydrogen and its products, we need more progress on definitions, standards, and certification mechanism. While only few certification mechanisms are now in force so far, there is a growing number of initiatives both at national and international levels. And it will be important to gain further insights into business models, governance, financing, and other mechanisms that can contribute to the creation of sustainable low carbon hydrogen markets and facilitate their international trade. And all these need to be aligned with national net zero targets and also hopefully foster mutually beneficial trade partnerships. So in this context, we have set 3 objectives for today's webinar. 1, to understand the considerations and challenges around certification for international hydrogen trade and also impacts on end users. 2, to provide inputs on priority areas to harmonize certification mechanism and in turn facilitate international trade in hydrogen. And also finally, to discuss the roles that government, private sector, international organization can play in developing hydrogen certification. So I'm very pleased that for this webinar today, we managed to bring together distinguished experts from governments, private sector, project developers, certification bodies, and different sectoral associations and international organizations to discuss these issues. And I would also like to welcome and thank all the participants who are here to listen and contribute to the discussion. Now, the exchange that we will have today will be extremely important for us to enhance our work going forward on low carbon hydrogen. We believe that this dialogue or this kind of exchanges can create a sound basis for developing effective cooperation among various different organizations to complement each other's work. For instance, OECD work on financing and enabling conditions for low carbon hydrogen could complement technology focus and policy reviews done by IEA. So this is just a first webinar on low carbon hydrogen in a series of events that we will be organizing this year under the OECD CEFIN program. So today, after this, for each session, we will have a series of a presentation followed by Q&A. So I would invite participants to not to be shy and be very active to pose questions. And you can do that through either using the chat function in Zoom or by simply raising your hand and turning on the camera so that you can be seen by all the participants. And today's webinar's recording will be available on our website for CEFIN at the OECD, and also presentations and summary notes as well. So hopefully all this exchange and what we'll do today will be kept on record for future reference as well. Now, without further ado, I want to hand over the floor to Joseph Cordonnier, who opened the meeting earlier. And he is the industry lead on the OECD CEFIN program. And then he will present further information from this working paper I mentioned and how we will proceed on this webinar today. And I wish you a very productive discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kumi. And I hope that everybody can now see the slides. So I will present shortly the working paper we have released last year on green hydrogen in emerging economies, and also explain a bit how this links to the discussions today on certification. So first, we have started at the Environment Directorate of the OECD to work on green hydrogen within a program that is called the Clean Energy Finance and Investment Mobilization Program, that is country-oriented and working with key emerging economies to strengthen enabling conditions and to foster investment in low-carbon technologies in those countries. Within that program, we are working since last year on industry decarbonization. And when discussing with our countries, who are Colombia, Egypt, India, as well as 4 ASEAN countries, so Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam, and the Philippines. Many of our counterparts in the government, as well industry actors and financial institutions, were asking us how green hydrogen could help decarbonize the industry, but as well power and mobility sector. So we have decided to work specifically on identifying what were the key success factors for projects in emerging economies to emerge. This work that we have done on green hydrogen is therefore really much connected to the other activities we're undertaking in those countries. And in the paper, as you can see in the box in that slide, we have adopted a value chain approach to make sure that we're covering from the electrolyzer manufacturing to the end uses of green hydrogen. We have as well identified a few questions on how could countries establish national strategies to create enabling conditions. And we also propose 8 case studies of flagship projects. So a very short reminder on hydrogen contributions to the global energy mix. Hydrogen is today well recognized as one of the solutions that can help achieving net zero by 2050. And most of the net zero or the pathways that are aligned with net zero today show that compared to the current level of green hydrogen demand that you can see on the the left bar in red, we will see a 5 to 6-fold increase in hydrogen use. And most of this hydrogen is deemed to be green hydrogen or low carbon hydrogen by the time. Another key elements, and this is really the backdrop of the working paper, is to address the entire value chain of green hydrogen. It's especially complex. So we have an upstream part, which goes from the manufacturing of electrolyzers that themselves can require critical minerals and therefore some mining activities, to the availability of upstream resources, which are primarily water, as well as cheap renewable energy or low carbon electricity sources. So primarily wind and solar today, but of course low carbon hydrogen can be produced as well, for instance, out of biomass. On the midstream part, this is the production itself, and you can see here the importance of storage and transport. That means that enabling infrastructures will be key, and that having them in a country will be a critical area to develop a sound green hydrogen market. And you can as well see in the dotted line the conversion, transport, and exports to the downstream, meaning that green hydrogen is a molecule that can be used in the industry, but in order to trade it and to export it, it may have to be converted, for instance, under the form of green ammonia. Finally, what you can see on the downstream parts, and that is particularly relevant for emerging economies that have good conditions to produce green hydrogen at low cost, is that the consumption could take place, of course, as domestic consumption directly under the form of green hydrogen, could go through exports, but could also be done under the form of green products. And that means that having green hydrogen at low cost in the country could also provide an opportunity, for instance, to manufacture products such as green ammonia or green steel and develop the downstream industry. So as we can see in the value chain, especially for emerging economies, there is a good momentum to develop green hydrogen, but it could be for domestic use as well as for exports. And we have also observed over the last years that many governments were working on partnerships to develop hydrogen trade. So hydrogen today is mainly produced and consumed at single big industrial facilities, but its forecast in the next decades is that it will be widely traded, with 25% of hydrogen that could be traded internationally by 2050. On the right side of the chart, you can see examples of a few partnerships that have been established or announced over the last couple of years. And you can see a few countries that may become potential exporters and therefore have also huge opportunities offered by green hydrogen. This is illustrated as well by some of the first projects and large projects that we have seen in emerging economies. So here we just take an example that you can also find in the paper about HAF Global. It's a project of e-fuels production in Chile, so mainly on methanol. And the purpose here is to first produce green hydrogen, but also to combine it with CO2 capture in order to produce gasoline and export it then for the mobility sector across the world. So again, to emphasize the importance of trade for these first flagship projects to emerge. And more generally, so beyond the trade aspects, the key lessons learned from the case studies are also showing the importance to have the mature value chain, existing markets, and supporting conditions. And I have here circled in the slides two important messages of the first projects that have reached final investment decisions that we analyze in our paper. The first one is the importance of the existing market. So green hydrogen is not traded internationally today, and one of the limitations for that is the lack of understanding or the lack of applications for green hydrogen as such, or low carbon hydrogen. And the second lesson that I highlighted is the importance of vertically integrated partnerships. So many of these projects are built at the moment between renewable electricity suppliers and hydrogen producers as such, so working on the electrolysis. But more and more, we can also see agreement with off-takers directly. Yeah, so finally, how does all this analysis leads to the discussion on certification? So we can see the importance of trade, we can see the importance of mature market and common understanding to have a sound use of the products in the applications where this is where it is the most suitable. And we have also analyzed all the various instruments that could be developed by the public sector in order to foster the market creation and the market growth of countries. So this is based on policy toolboxes that are available in the literature, as well as on thorough stakeholder consultation. And one of the very important elements that stakeholders have noted is that having the existence of either guarantees of origin or hydrogen certifications and tracking system, which starts with a common understanding of what is green hydrogen or what is low carbon hydrogen, is a necessary conditions in order to create regional markets or global markets for green hydrogen. And hence, this is why we organized today's webinar, to understand a bit what these prerequisites for green hydrogen trade and low carbon hydrogen trade is, with three main purposes that correspond quite well to the three sessions. The first one is to understand the considerations and challenges around certifications. So also to understand what is a certification, what should be included in a certification, and what are the current mechanisms and initiatives that are being used. The second objective is to discuss on the priority areas to harmonize those certification mechanisms. So there are a lot of initiatives, but in order to support as well international trade, it's important that we can at least have the possibility to match these certifications or to make them interoperable and to track and monitor all these exchanges and flows. And the third objective is to discuss the roles of various actors, including governments, with some governments that are taking and leading the way forward to develop some certification mechanisms, but as well private sector, where some companies, including certification companies and audit companies, are developing their own standards and auditing methodologies, as well as international organizations that are also creating a good place for dialogue. So we will now move to the first session of the webinar. And before starting, I would just like to remind, as Kumi said, a bit the structure of each session and of the webinar. So we'll have these three sessions with a couple of polls between session 1 and session 2. And each session will be organized in two parts. So the first part will be the presentations by the speakers with or without slides, followed by exchanges with the audience. During this Q&A, we would be glad if you can either raise your hands and put your camera on so that we can propose you to step in and ask your question, or you can also simply write a question in the chat and we will pick some of those. Yeah, so starting with session 1 on the challenges and considerations for hydrogen certification. We will have 4 speakers during this session. So Sam Bartlett, who's the director of the Green Hydrogen Standard within the Green Hydrogen Organization. Thomas Corblanc, senior principal at the Rocky Mountain Institute. Yoran Kim, who works as a deputy director at the Air Quality Future Strategy Division at the Ministry of Environment of Korea. And Wouter van Hout, global head of business development working at Certify. So we will have a few guiding questions that the speakers will cover during their introduction, and that we're happy as well to take up during the Q&A. They're all listed in that slides, but I won't read them out loud. You probably see the slide, and I therefore welcome Sam to make his introductory remarks.
Thank you very much. Can you just confirm that you can hear me okay? Thank you for the thumbs up. And it's nice to see everyone today. And it's nice to be the first person invited to speak today. I'm not going to do a very heavy presentation. But I think it would be great we have in this particular panel some diverse perspectives on the questions that have been put forward. So I just wanted to put forward a couple of introductory comments about, first of all, who we are and what we're doing, and just a couple of quick reflections on the questions that you've posed today, and then look forward to a discussion. So my name's Sam Bartlett. I'm the director of the Green Hydrogen Standard at the Green Hydrogen Organization. And the Green Hydrogen Organization is a relatively new group that was established 18 months ago. And our work on green hydrogen standards has been one of our major projects. Essentially, we are a champion, a representative of the growing green hydrogen industry on the global stage. And one of the key things that we've been focusing on is the importance of standards and certification to actually get this industry up and running and moving quickly. What I'll do is, instead of giving you the sort of the Green Hydrogen Organization pitch, in the chat box, I'll just put a couple of links. One, a link to our green hydrogen standard, which includes a definition of green hydrogen. I'll talk a little bit more about that. The second thing I'll do is provide a link to some of the work we're doing on good contracting around the world. In the last couple of years, we've seen dozens of countries come forward with hydrogen strategies, which is, of course, very welcome. There's a lot of interest and excitement in developing the sector. But as you've highlighted in your introduction, there's a need to put in place the enabling environment, all of the standards and regulations that will actually help bring this industry into being. So we've been doing a lot of work together with development partners and looking at what those key building blocks might be. So the three key things I wanted to reflect on today. The first point I wanted to make is people often talk about, the hydrogen economy or green hydrogen, and they say, oh, there's a lot of hype. Yes, there is a lot of hype, but it's important to remember, first of all, this is not a new industry. There is already today somewhere in the order of 90 to 100 million tons of hydrogen being produced. And the challenge with that is that it's a very dirty process. As a rule of thumb, basically for every kilo of hydrogen that we're producing, we produce between 10 and 12 kilos of carbon dioxide. So there's already an existing industry, a hydrogen industry and a traded ammonia industry. Ammonia is shipped around the world today in substantial volumes. So we're not starting from zero when we talk about facilitating the trade in green hydrogen or clean hydrogen or low carbon hydrogen. So that's point number one. There's an existing foundation, an existing trade that we can build on. The challenge is the fragmentation that we're seeing around the world. We know there's quite a lot of consensus on how to measure emissions from the different hydrogen production pathways. We know how to do that. What we don't have is any kind of emerging consensus on what are the sort of appropriate thresholds. And two prominent examples. There's a long-running debate in Europe about the definition of green hydrogen, and it's linked to the definition of what it means to use renewable electricity. And we're still, lots of us that will be on this call are still waiting for the final so-called delegated acts that will actually provide the definition of what can be considered green hydrogen in Europe. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, you have a very substantial piece of legislation, the Inflation Reduction Act, which provides some very substantial subsidies for hydrogen production, low carbon hydrogen production. And there you have, again, some uncertainty about exactly what those regulations will look like, what, in order to qualify for the very for the largest subsidy, exactly what will be the eligibility criteria there. And there'll be some subtly different requirements in the US to do with labor standards and other issues. So straight away, just looking at the US and Europe, you have a different approach. If you expand your search wider and you look at the emerging definitions in China, in India, in Korea, in some of the markets that we mentioned as potential customers for this product, you have differences again. You also see fragmentation, and that's one of the great things about hydrogen is its versatility. You'll see hydrogen being used in the fertilizer industry, in the power sector, in the steel sector, in the chemicals industry. And you're starting to see definitions and standards emerge. So definitions for green steel, definitions for green fuels. So we're going to have quite complex value chains. You might have somebody in Namibia producing green hydrogen. They might convert it into green ammonia. It might get shipped to Rotterdam. And then some of it might then be cracked back into hydrogen. Some of it will be used directly as ammonia. So, and then some of that will go into the power sector. Some of it will go into the steel sector. So tracking this is going to be incredibly challenging. So my key message is, it would be nice if we could all agree in the next 12 months on, one standard and one certification scheme. That's not going to happen. There's going to be, because different countries and different industries have different needs and different advantages, you're going to continue to see different approaches to standards and different needs in terms of certification. So my key message today is that what we all need to work on is also thinking about the underlying data standards so there can be interoperability. So if you're producing hydrogen, converting it into ammonia, and then moving it into different value chains, that you have the information that can be passed on through those value chains so we can make the calculations that we need. The second thing that I'd like to highlight today is normally when we're talking about hydrogen standards, green and blue and gray, and I've done it today, is I've focused so far mostly talking about the emissions profile of hydrogen. And that, of course, is absolutely important. And we have work that we can draw on there with the IPHE and others. As I said, there's emerging international consensus about how to measure the emissions from different hydrogen production pathways. But our view at GH2 is that we need a broader approach to standards. And we have 3 pillars in our approach. We, of course, look at the emissions profile, but we also look at a wider set of issues related to the ESG performance and the development impact of these projects. And essentially, our key message here is that we need to learn the lessons from the oil, gas, and mining industry as we're growing this industry. The green hydrogen industry needs its own social license to operate. There are issues associated with land use, with labor laws, with water, both in terms of the utilization, wastewater, and a whole set of issues also around governance and around taxation about how these projects are going to work. And the essential question of, well, are we going to develop these projects of essentially islands of green hydrogen production for export? Or are we going to try to leverage these projects to improve energy sector outcomes in the host countries and in the host communities? So what I'll do is I'll drop in the chat 2 links to our work. The first is the green hydrogen standard itself. And what we've done here is not revolutionary. We've built on the work of IPHE and others, and we have an approach to emissions measurement for green hydrogen. We're looking at the ESG performance of green hydrogen projects using the IFC performance standards as a benchmark. And we're looking at the development impact of these projects using the Sustainable Development Goals. So we're just bringing together those threads and trying to suggest a more holistic approach to looking at the opportunities of green hydrogen. And then finally, just a bit of a plug for some of the other work that we're doing. Again, lots of countries have developed hydrogen strategies. The next step is to put in place some of the building blocks in terms of the enabling environment for these projects. Some countries have a long history of, for example, power purchase agreements and things like that that are needed to get a green hydrogen project up and running. In other countries, there's no tradition of that. There'll need to be substantial revisions to legislation, to regulation, and some very important questions around the contracts. What will these contracts look like? And crucially, what is in it for the host country and for the communities that will host these projects? What is the taxation going to look like? What are the contracts going to look like? So that's the second thread to our work at GH2. Essentially, when it comes to standards and certification, we published our standard about 12 months ago. We're now moving forward with testing the standard in some leading green hydrogen projects. We're working with project developers in China, India, Australia, Brazil, Kenya, South Africa, and essentially moving this standard from theory into practice. But we also recognize that there are, other approaches, and that what we need to be able to do is harmonize the work that we're doing with others, and also so that important specifications, for example, if a hydrogen producer in Namibia needs to demonstrate adherence to some additionality criteria so that their hydrogen can be considered green in Europe, that we need a global system that can also harmonize with regional and national requirements. So it's a complex landscape and a complex industry, but we're not starting from zero. And our approach sort of emphasizes openness and open data standards so that we can begin to work together to realize the potential. So thank you for giving me the chance to kick things off today. I look forward to hearing from others on the panel and participating in the conversation today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sam. Thank you as well for all the considerations on going a bit beyond the greenhouse gases emissions. That's really interesting, and on the considerations as well on the trades that we will also address during the session 2 on the interoperability between countries. Now, Thomas Koblenc from RMI, the Rocky Mountain Institutes, will take the floor. Thank you.
Thank you. So I will spend a little bit of time talking about the state of the current state of certifications and market mechanisms for hydrogen trade. But before I do that, perhaps a few words about the Rocky Mountain Institute. I think we've recently done, and I will share some content here from a piece of research that we conducted together with IRENA. I think that most of you know IRENA, but Rocky Mountain Institute might be a bit of a white space. So we were founded 40 years ago, 42, in the US, a nonprofit founded by Dr. Amory Lovins. And we've worked relentlessly in the last 4 decades on sustainable energy solutions. And I would say lately expanded beyond the US and across sectors to a position now where we are trying to facilitate the energy transition across major economies and in particular what is often referred to as heavy industry or heavy transport sectors or hard to abate industries where hydrogen plays a very important role. Before I kick off, and I think there is a presentation that will be shared on screen, or I can share my screen. but it's worth reflecting a little bit on what we're trying to do here and what the real problem is. And the problem, I think, very simply put, is that we're trying to put hydrogen into the market in a way that it reduces carbon emissions. The problem is that when you get a molecule of hydrogen delivered, you can't measure that property from the product. You can't tell how it was produced. You can't sample it or test it physically and understand what the underlying production process was. So that means you need to figure something out to build trust in the market, and that's where the certifications come in. Now, we have other systems that provide similar, trust in markets. The biggest and most elaborate auditing and accounting system we have is for our financial systems, and that system has been in the working for some 400 years or so, and it's still not perfect. There's still no one single standard for how to do financial accounting, and we just introduced sophisticated tools like blockchains, and still we had a huge FTX fraud just the last couple of months. So there will, I think it's fair to say that there will be lots of, it's a complex market emerging, and there will be lots of considerations to make. But I think it's also important to not make perfect the enemy of great here, and to build on learnings we have from other markets. So this first slide illustrates, and I think this is just highlighting the fact that we will have global trade of hydrogen. These are suggested or announced routes of export and import routes globally. I think, if anything, the transatlantic export from US is understated. Sam referred to the policies that are coming into place in the US, and if anything, that's a tidal wave waiting to happen, and hydrogen-based products being finding ways to markets outside of the US. Going to the next slide. I think one of our insights in having worked on creating what we call attribute markets, which is basically creating a way for markets to acknowledge the value of something which is not measurable in the product, is that certification is a required but not sufficient part of market creating. You do need standards and certifications because you need a common understanding of what the product is, or what the attribute that you value is. But then implementation and trust in the market requires a reliable and strong governance. It requires enforcement, and it requires some level of tracking and an associated business model. And these can look very different depending on the market, and you can have multiple business models in place at the same time. And it can range from, in one end of the spectrum, what I would refer to as the fair trade model, where you basically certify production and then you stamp a label on the product on the shelf, and that builds trust for the consumer that this is the product that actually has the attributes that you're looking for, without actually having to track every transaction of that pack of coffee as it makes its way from the producer all the way to the shelf. But other markets have been built around much more complicated tracing and tracking and sort of transaction ledgers. Energy markets in particular are more often than not following a more sophisticated model for good reasons, right? But then in the end, scale adoption will link to policy. The markets that hydrogen will be sold into are setting the rules of the game for being providing a viable product. So those policies will roll back into the supply chain and sort of set conditions for producers in the exporting countries. Next slide, please. There are basically two types of certification schemes. There are emerging in parallel globally at the moment. There is the voluntary schemes, and you have mandatory markets. So mandatory schemes sets the benchmark for production in production or supply of hydrogen in a jurisdictions. And voluntary schemes are, obviously optional to comply with. When we mapped, and I didn't actually put this into the presentation, but together with the IRENA team, we started mapping the compatibility between supply side schemes and the target market regulations. And at the moment, there is not a lot of compatibility, which means that while we have a plethora of production side, certification schemes being developed, very few of them are sufficiently defined or compatible with what the markets will actually want. There are a few exceptions, but in general, I think this is true. And you see situations as well where, for example, in the US, under the same legislative package, you have two different specifications to relate to as a manufacturer. So, and that's for the government, sort of the federal policy. So you have one set of specifications which will allow you to qualify for what's called the hydrogen hub support, which is a separate program under the DOE. And you have a different specification which allows you to qualify for a production tax credit. And then depending on which state you're operating in, you will have a third set of policies or regulations and a specification on your hydrogen that allows you to either be viable for or comply with local the local clean fuel standards. So even within a single market, this is not a perfectly harmonized transactional sort of market. Next slide, please. So what is, I think, strongly recommended, or what we see is valuable, is that at least the technical components of the certification scheme become harmonized. So you harmonize on the scope of what do you actually include and what do you consider to be required to report on, if you like, as a basis for this attribute that you want to provide your customers. So what are the system boundaries? How far upstream do you go? Which components are included? Which kinds of greenhouse gas emissions, and so on? Is it only a green hydrogen, to use the simple terms here, is it only a green hydrogen standard, or is it a standard that also allows for other production pathways to transact in the same market, and so on? So there are a couple of technical components that are important to align on, but then achieving a single standard, as I think Sam also referred to, is unlikely, but harmonization and sort of some level of compatibility will highly sort of improve the transactability of the market. Next slide. And I'll leave you with this. I think this is our mapping again of what is the current state of affairs of market mechanisms required to enable global trade at a really rapidly scaling manner for hydrogen, low carbon hydrogen. So at the top left, you can see across top to bottom, you have the different components in the market. So starting with certification and the conditions of production, and then layering on top different market functions all the way down to driving adoption at scale. And then left to right is the supply chain, starting with production, and then actually starting with extraction, if you like, or generation, going over to production, transport, distribution, and end user. And there are some really large glaring gaps here. One is on how to manage the international transport and distribution, which includes blending considerations. and different energy losses in the supply chain and whatnot. And also in the sort of downstream tracking and product specification is also a big gap. So happy to unpack this further, but I also want to make sure we have time for some conversation. I do want to highlight here that in addition to certifications per se, I think there's another maybe easier and more important area for harmonization, which is what we think about as a product norm. And a product norm is different than a specification or a standard. A product norm is more like, you know, the adopted definition of a commodity that is traded on the exchange. So a good example here, or an analogy, would be the iron ore market, where the traded commodity is a 62.5% iron content product, which is exactly what everyone is hinging and linking their contracts to. But very few batches or deliveries of iron ore actually has that iron ore content, but it allows the market to have a spot market which is linked to one norm or definition, and then you can create commercial contracts linked to that that reference point. And you know, I don't have a crystal ball of saying what the price elasticity around that norm will look like, but that's what markets do. They figure out price elasticity and they figure out the value of over or underperforming versus the norm. So with that, I will wrap up, and thanks you for your attention and time.
Thank you very much, Thomas, for the presentation. And it's also very interesting to see the value chain approach that you display here, and the analogy with iron ore. So we will have now the presentation of Yuran Kim from the government of the Republic of Korea.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me?
We can hear you well. Thank you.
Okay. I'm glad to have an opportunity to introduce our hydrogen economy policies to you. To briefly summarize my presentation, I will introduce the Korea's overall hydrogen economy policy and then explain the role of the Ministry of Environment in hydrogen economy policy with specific examples. And finally, add Korea's current stage of the introduction of hydrogen certification. Going to the next slide, please. This slide shows the timeline of Korea's hydrogen policies progress. Interestingly, Korea's MOE introduced the purchase subsidy for fuel cell electric vehicles, as called hydrogen vehicles, in 2013. And that time, hydrogen vehicles were considered as solution to environmental problem by reducing air pollutant from vehicles. In 2018, Hyundai Motors launched new hydrogen light-duty vehicle Nexo. Furthermore, the Korea's government began to take an interest in value chain of hydrogen economy and announced the hydrogen economy roadmap in 2019. This roadmap mainly focused on hydrogen mobility, power generation, green hydrogen production, and life cycle-based policy framework. And then the National Assembly passed the Hydrogen Economy Promotion and Hydrogen Safety Management Act, as called the Hydrogen Act, in February 2020, with a view to creating the legal framework for the realization of the hydrogen economy roadmap. This act was mandated last year to introduce the definition of clean hydrogen and other meaningful changes. I will briefly deal with this amendment at the end of the presentation. Please, next slide. It shows three main strategies on the most recent plan, new hydrogen economy policy announced in November last year. Scale up, build up, level up. The first strategy focuses on quantitative expansion of supply and demand. The next strategy build-up includes new initiatives such as liquid hydrate fueling stations or introduction of new legal framework. The last strategy supports the technology development and increasing profitability of related industries. Next, please. Based on this plan, the Ministry of Environment is in charge of these red parts. Next, please. Here is the summary of the role of the MOE considering the life cycle of hydrogen. The first, producing green hydrogen based on our environmental infrastructure, hydropower plant in water purification plant, or organic waste disposal facilities producing a lot of biogases, and the building hydrogen fueling stations and supporting transition to zero emission vehicles, including hydrogen vehicles. Next, please. The MOE has invested mainly two types of green hydrogen production plant. Type A plants or use water electrolysis technology in water power plant. K-Water, the public organization in Korea, started the first project in Seongnam, a city adjacent to Seoul, by using its small hydropower plant at water purification plant. It is expected to produce green hydrogen this year and provide hydrogen to near fueling stations. There are two more similar projects in Chungju and Miryang. The Chungju project is the largest project among the MOE's projects. Next, please. Type B plants are on the very beginning stage, which extract hydrogen from biogas. Korea has above 100 biogas facilities by treating organic waste such as food waste or sewage sludge. The MOE has a plan to select two projects in 2023. Next, please. The next part is about hydrogen fueling stations, one of the most important parts of Korea's hydrogen policy. Until 2022, the MOE built 229 fueling stations and aims to expand by 320 in 2023. In 2018, there were only 14 fueling stations in Korea. The performance achieved in the short time is based on active efforts of the government. For example, the MOE led to find suitable sites to build fueling stations and share the information to related industries who have an interest on building or operating fueling stations. Next, please. The last part is about hydrogen vehicles. In 2022, over 10,000 of new hydrogen vehicles were on the road. You can find that the demand to hydrogen vehicles continues to increase every year. In 2021, Korea ranked first in the world on hydrogen vehicles distribution. Next, please. Furthermore, the MOE expands the policy target from light-duty vehicles for individuals to medium and heavy-duty vehicles such as buses or trucks. Honestly, the market size of hydrogen heavy-duty vehicles is very small because these vehicles launched from 2020. Lower floor buses, which is usually used as a city bus, are sold over 100 every year for the last 2 years. It was really amazing performance, I think. The MOE has actively created demands for hydrogen buses or trucks by collaborating with local government. For example, Busan, the second largest city in Korea, has a plan to transit its around 1,000 city buses or commute buses to hydrogen buses by 2025. Next, please. This slide introduced the current stage of hydrogen certification led by the different ministry, the Ministry of Trade, Industry, and Energy. Hydrogen Act was amended in May 2022 to introduce the legal basis for hydrogen certification. It mentioned the definition of clean hydrogen, the legal basis on designating certification institutions, and on introducing clean hydrogen energy portfolio standard as called CHPS. However, this act is not yet taken into effect, and the MOTIE continues to build more detailed regulations. Detailed information on hydrogen certification, such as CO2 emission standards or other things, has not been finalized and is still under discussion. If you have any more questions on hydrogen certification, I can forward your questions to the MOTIE. Lastly, as producer and end user of green hydrogen, the MOE deeply agrees that green hydrogen production should be expanded. On the other hand, we also keep an eye on high unit cost of producing green hydrogen because there is the possibility that hydrogen vehicles drivers who use hydrogen will be burdened due to the increase in charging costs. It is the end of my present. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yoran. And this is also very interesting to see that the Republic of Korea has introduced some definitions of clean hydrogen as a basis before working and establishing the institution for certification. So we'll move to the last presentation of session 1 that will be done by Wouter van Hout by Certified. I also invite all participants to get ready for the Q&A session right after Wouter's presentation. And if you have any question, feel free either to raise your hand after the presentation or to write your question in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I all of a sudden I realized now why Sam of GH2 was so happy that he could start at first, because a lot of very relevant things have already been mentioned. So during my presentation, I'll try to go quickly and to highlight maybe certain elements that have not been stressed yet. So if we can go to the next slide, just to present myself. I'm working already quite a long time on the topic of certification. I started the Certify project back in 2014 as the coordinator. I'm still a GT6 Sentinelec liaison. This is the particular working group working on an upcoming European standard of GEOs for all kind of energy vectors. So that's renewable electricity historically, but now also being upgraded towards biomethane, hydrogen, heating and cooling. And also I have been with the Association of Issuing Bodies, which is the European organization where historically all of the renewable electricity issuing bodies gather, who expanded their scheme towards biomethane and hydrogen. I have been the chair of their gas scheme group and a board member until the end of last year. So please continue. I had 2 slides, but I think they've already been presented by Sam and Thomas before. And so why are we all doing this? Hydrogen is in lots of instances is a feedstock, or could be a fuel that is going to help other industries to decarbonize. Next slide, please. And therefore, it's important that we have the slide before. Therefore, we have a need of a tracking system going from the carbon footprint of hydrogen into the different end sectors. And here, I think it's already important to say that, as mentioned by the previous speakers, we see that a lot of jurisdictions, being it Europe, being it Korea, being it Japan, being it Taiwan, being it US, they are all putting their own regulation into place in their country, but very often they're also putting a regulation into place depending on the end sector. And that's indeed how we are ending up with various definitions of what is good and bad hydrogen. And I really use the words good and bad to say that there's a certain subjectivity to it, and that everybody is developing their own labels with their own criteria, whether it's carbon footprint alone, whether it's also looking at the primary energy that's being used, is it coming from renewables or not. And then we also look at other programs which are going even further into the sustainability criteria, typically looking at water, air, and land, or even going beyond, looking at the impact it can create domestically, like GH2, but also H2 global. And this means is that we're getting really a variety of markets. If you go to the next slide. And there, I think I would like to stress that the markets in a lot of instances, they are driven by regulation. And it's afterwards that certification systems are putting in place to make sure that they can track and check compliance with a certain regulation. And the disharmonization or the divergence of the amount of definitions of what is good and bad, some people will call it green, blue, etc. They rightly differ, and that means it's going to be harder for international markets to find their price premium. This is leading to a lot of the certificates not being fungible. And that we're not only seeing on the mandatory markets. Currently, we also see a whole lot of voluntary schemes which are being made. We have so many standards out there by the certification bodies, by certified. This is one of that I've been developing myself, by the GH2 standard. And also in those voluntary markets, we see now that there are so many certification systems that it becomes very hard to compare apples to apples. I compare it always towards bio chicken. When I started to buy bio chicken 10 years ago in the supermarket, every brand used to have their own bio chicken label, and all of them were expensive. And the fact that I couldn't see a common label of trust, many people just ended up buying the cheaper non-biological chicken. It's only when governments, like for instance, the European Commission, have been standardizing one or two bio chicken labels that we really saw the uptake going forward. So that's maybe the first lesson, and similar to what Thomas has mentioned on the US and the divergence of standards, we see a similar thing in Europe. For instance, to define what is green hydrogen under the Renewable Energy Directive, which is called renewable fuel of non-biological origin. This is one set of criteria. So this is something that you need to follow to enter into a certain mandatory market. On the other hand, when you want to get sustainable finance, you need to correspond to the definitions of the EU taxonomy. And then when you tell something to your customer, you need to also comply with European guarantees of origin regulation. And then when you want to get a subsidy, you have to comply with the energy, with the ETS Innovation Fund. All of that have other cutoff criteria. They all have different definitions of what's green and or what's good and what's bad. They have different scopes of carbon emission calculations. Sometimes they even have different methodologies on how to calculate that. So yes, indeed, it's not so easy. And I think the only way forward is to work on long-term, but very long-term harmonization, because I don't think that policymakers are going to harmonize their definitions overnight. And on the next slide, that's maybe the other main message I would like to bring, is that we see that a lot of work is being done on carbon footprinting. But I think to make a robust certification scheme, we need to do much more, and maybe just already start by the terminology. We see so many people talking about certification, others about verification. People talk about certification schemes, others about certification systems. And already in that, we see that the terminology is not completely aligned. We also see that a lot of the frameworks are not used the same. And this is typically what I put on the screen could be a certification scheme design fundamentals and everything that you need to cover to have a certification scheme, but that's typically the back office. This is not necessarily what is needed to create a front office, and we see other frameworks where back office and front office considerations are being united. So that's also something to work on, so that the world is at least not only using the same terminology, but also using the same framework in there. And then maybe in a nutshell to say what we've been doing in Certify on the next phase. So we've been historically working a lot on creating another label in 2014 on what's green and blue. In retrospect, I think it's much more important that we are able to measure in a common way internationally what's the carbon footprint, and that we are able to understand what is the scope of the carbon footprinting exercise. Is it well to gate? Is it well to engine? Is it well to weight, etc. Rather than defining labels together. I think that the industry can perfectly start trading as long as the data sheet of the hydrogen is made in a similar way internationally. And I would just like to say that we already been going through our piloting phase in 2017, 2019, and now we are going forward with other objectives. And maybe just to give in a nutshell certain ideas, and we can skip 2 slides, I think. Yeah, so the one before. So as Certify, our platform is being used, and I just pulled the stats of what are the transactions on the platform since January 2022 till today. And there you can see that we had more than 28,000 GEOs being issued, 16,000 are being traded. Every GEO represents a megawatt hour. We had our first commercial successes back in 2019 with GEOs, with air products using this instrument to officially prove towards H2 Mobility Germany that all of the hydrogen being brought to those refueling stations were green. But we also had other successes with the transport for London. What are we doing currently? That's in the next slide. So historically, we've been working on guarantees of origin, and that's what you can see in the green box, where typically a guarantee of origin, the scope of the carbon footprinting is well to gate. So that's all of the emissions within the battery limit, as well as the upstream emissions, mainly coming from power or from bio based pathways. And now with the upcoming new regulation in Europe, the famous RFNBOs, we see that the certification needs to be well till engine. So that means that we need to increase the scope of our footprinting. And we also need to change from a book and claim towards a mass balance system. So this is one of the main points that we're working on today. In parallel, and that's maybe that's going to be my final slide. We're also helping a lot already to see how the hydrogen certification that we've been working on, how can it be used in downstream applications. So Inicio as a company is working very closely together with Fertilizers Europe to make an ammonia scheme, ammonia certification scheme. By the way, we're having similar assignments with the Fertilizer Institute in the US, as well as the Global Ammonia Energy Association. So I would say there we're trying to to see how we can expand from a hydrogen scheme into the derivatives. And I would also like to mention that we recently signed a memorandum of understanding with the roundtable of a sustainable biomass, and RSB is particularly strong at the sustainable aviation fuels. So that's one of the topics we will collaborate on. And there, I think it's very important to indeed make sure that the basis of hydrogen certification are being repeated in different end sectors, and that those end sectors don't start with their own certification scheme from scratch, but you need to keep on building on top of pre-existing building blocks to make sure that certification along the value chain can be done in a very systemic and incremental way. And I think that were the main messages that I would like to bring today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wouter. As we have started a bit late, we will now still maintain the Q&A session, but maybe just for the next 10 minutes before moving to the polls. We have received already a few questions, maybe the first one to Thomas, that is also linked to our session 3. You have analyzed different kind of mechanisms, including the voluntary ones, the mandatory ones. So based on your analysis, what kind of organizations do you think are the more qualified to issue such certification and to have the proper accreditation? And following that, how do you make as well these mandatory and voluntary schemes work together at some point?
Thank you. That's a good question. I think irrespective of who issues the certifications, I think there, our view and experience of having set up some of these voluntary markets is that you will still need independent auditing and accreditation of the certificates, right? So you and that will look a little bit different depending on whether it's a voluntary market or a policy-driven market. In the end, again, I think we're all saying very similarly that it's all about building trust in the supply chain, right? And the fewer systems we have in place, the easier it is for the consumers to trust the supply chain, right? But again, governance is equally important. You need to have, any certificate which is produced by the supply chain itself without external or independent accreditation is going to be scrutinized more and has a higher threshold to achieve the trust that you need to transact. I don't know if that answered the question, but governance is really important, is the short version.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Maybe another question for Wouter. You described a bit the scope and what could be in the certification, out of the certification. So also, how could green hydrogen certification have an impact on the certification of other products such as green ammonia or e-fuels? So how do you build on the green hydrogen certification to certify as well other products?
Yeah. I think it's rather straightforward. We've been building certified, so hence hydrogen certification, on the building blocks of existing biomethane certification schemes, as well as renewable electricity certification schemes. And what we see today is when you do carbon footprinting, for instance, on green steel, you have a lot of criteria, or there are a lot of calculation methods which are already historically existing. When you are going to change to new processes to clean up steel production, you will go towards hydrogen. And I think it's important that the steel sector actually sees the green hydrogen certification coming out of a hydrogen certification system are taken as such as an input into the carbon footprinting exercise of the steel industry or the ammonia industry, the methanol industry, the sustainable aviation fuel industry, and that the steel industry or any of those downstream industries, they don't try to build a completely new certification scheme also starting from renewable electricity, so that basically they respect the building blocks that the downstream building blocks that have already been done by others.
Thank you, Wouter. I will now ask a question from the chat, and after my question, Cécile Seguino from the OECD can also comment. So the next question is, I believe, for any speaker or any panelist who would like to take it. What kind of research needs do you see for the certification of green hydrogen? So do we need to work more, for instance, on the methodology and CO2 accounting, or do you see other areas where research would support it?
I like to take that. We didn't certify a lot of work on carbon footprinting. We realized that the ISO standard framework is actually a very robust framework existing, except for one thing, and that's allocation in multi-input and output plants. So typically when you have multiple streams going in and multiple streams coming out, their ISO standards are not complete, and they allow for mass-based allocation, energy-based allocation, mole-based allocation, and value-based allocation, and so forth and so onwards. This has already been detected by IPHE, and that's really the work that they have been doing. That should also contribute thereafter to the creation of a new ISO standard. So the new ISO standard carbon footprinting is going to base itself on IPHE work. So I think that's something that's already taken into place. We saw that there are new work items being created in ISO to really have common international standards on what is book and claim, what is mass balance, because also there we see a wide variety of themes to the same words being used. And then going forward, I think that there's really a role to be played internationally on what do we think as a good oversight, governance, control organisms. What do we believe can we harmonize internationally on what is a qualified certification body versus a verification body that we see in the LCFS standard in California. So I think there's a lot of work that still needs to be done. Except I would say for carbon footprinting, I think we can only call international jurisdiction and private schemes to adopt ISO standards coming up based on IPHE work.
Thank you, Wouter. I see Thomas has his hand raised, so Thomas, feel free to step in, and then Cécile, you can ask your question. Thank you.
Thank you, Wouter. I think that was accurate. Two reflections. One is we're running into research needs into the implications of grid connection of electrolyzers and how to account for the marginal carbon impact of that, especially when you drop down effectively a spaceship of multi-gigawatt loads into a grid, which will have to handle that integration somehow. And depending on your underlying generation portfolio in that grid, it will have an impact on utilization of existing fossil fuel plants, or just the dispatch profiles of different assets on that grid. And this is a hotly debated topic in the US right now, because it's going to implicate the access to subsidies under the production tax credit. And it's really polarized at the moment, like terribly polarized in terms of which positions you see different stakeholders take. and I think what's really needed to bring stakeholders together and allowing the DOE and honestly, in the end, the IRS, a basis for doling out tax credits is proper fact-based and sort of model research.
Thank you, Thomas. Cecile, feel free to ask your question. I see that Sam has his hand raised, so Sam, maybe after Cecile's question, you can answer either to the research needs or to both questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the very interesting presentation. On my side, not a question, but just wanted to follow up on the links with derivatives such as steel and cement that it has been mentioned previously, and also in the question raised in the webinar introduction, because we have currently this kind of discussion indeed on definition, standard for material for green steel on our side at the OECD. And on the link with green hydrogen certification, yes, first to highlight that certification of green hydrogen and certification of green steel are intertwined, as previously mentioned, because for steel production that will be based on green hydrogen, certification of green steel will require to know the emission that have been emitted for hydrogen production as an input indeed. So in that sense, certification of green hydrogen is also very key to enable a smooth implementation of green steel certification. And the second point I would like to stress is that indeed the stakes and challenges that have been mentioned for green hydrogen here very much echo also to the challenges currently discussed for green steel too. For instance, on definition, so for steel, we have currently a very fragmented landscape, no wide agreement on definition and threshold. Also, the need to take into account the heterogeneity in diverse production type, diverse industry structure, access to raw material. And we're currently indeed also reflecting how to acknowledge these differences when applying this definition and standard. And the topical second point that's currently discussed for steel on standard and certification is about precisely emission accounting and carbon intensity measurement. So basically, the key aspect is to first define and agree on this measurement methodology for emission accounting, so the scope, boundaries, and also the related data collection framework. So this is something that have been also mentioned in previous presentation, because it is precisely what is needed to certify that the commodity will comply with the standard. And here again, we have a lot of coexistence of methodology that may undermine this implementation for green steel standard if the comparability and interoperability is not possible. So yeah, just to highlight these texts for steel that are currently being discussed. And in the trade environment for steel, it's very crucial to ensure this measurement comparability and the interoperability aspect. So thank you, I stop here.
Sam, over to you.
Thanks. I just wanted to build on, I think Walter and Thomas have just raised two really important issues for our sector. Walter just briefly touched on the difference between the kind of mass balance versus book and claim models. They're very, very different beasts. And you can see in different jurisdictions, different people moving in different directions. You know, it's something that I think that we need to do more work on. If we're going to move towards a book and claim approach, which has lots of efficiency advantages, then there's lots of questions around the credibility to avoid double counting. Comes back to this question about trust and credibility, which is at the heart of what we're trying to do here. Thomas highlighted, you know, there's a storm on the horizon, you know, for the green hydrogen industry. And that's this, you know, we've seen a debate for many years in Europe about additionality. And now the same debate is coming to the US about grid connected projects. You're going to see the same thing happen in other jurisdictions in Australia, because all other things being equal, if we're using lots of power, then we're increasing the power costs for other consumers. So there's going to be a pushback as well. So this issue of the certification of
sí que está, sí.
Sorry, I'm getting some feedback, but there's the certification of the renewable electricity, which is actually going to come up in one of the forthcoming sessions, which is great. These things need to hang together. And then the last thing I was going to say about research, you know, there are hundreds of large green hydrogen projects, but they haven't reached final investment decision yet. And they haven't reached final investment decision because they're not yet bankable until you have an offtake agreement that you can take to a bank and you can say, here, I've got a commercially viable project. So I would say, look at these first offtake agreements. It's the term sheets and the way that they define and certify hydrogen within these first offtake agreements that will be key, because those first big offtake agreements will de facto set a benchmark for others. So I think that's an area where, we don't yet have sort of spot markets. We will have some large offtake agreements being signed this year in the next 18 months. And I think that's a really important focal point for our work, to look at how the producer and the customer agree in the offtake agreement the characteristics of this commodity that they'll be trading, and what systems the producer needs to put in place, and how the customer will be able to verify that. So yes, we need to look at regulations, but let's look at some of these early commercial agreements. They'll be crucial. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Sam. And I think also during session 2, when we discuss the harmonization, we can also expand on these topics and how producers, consumers, and overall the market actors can agree on the definitions. Before moving to the polls, just maybe one last comment by Timo Ritonumi from the government of Finland regarding the definitions and agreements on the terms of renewable, low carbon or green hydrogen.
Yeah, so good morning. Oh, actually, it's noon here in Finland. So it's this green renewable. So it's I would say it's non-legal term in the EU, because the delegated act will be on the renewable hydrogen, and renewable is really narrowly defined, that it has to be existing, or not existing, but additional wind and PV electricity. So it's according to that, it's renewable hydrogen, and then you have low carbon hydrogen, which will be, it's the rest of the renewables. So it's hydropower or bioenergy or even existing wind power. So it's funny that the existing wind power is not CO2 free, it's low carbon, but if you build a new one after the electrolyzer, it's renewable. But anyway, that's a definition. I think also it's nuclear also in this low carbon hydrogen definition, and I think also blue hydrogen will be in there if it's let's say low enough, and then rest it will be, it's gray hydrogen, but of course that's not defined by the legislation. So green is just like the bio chicken was mentioned, that it's a loose word. It's not defined in legislation, at least in EU. At least that's my opinion.
Thank you very much, Timo. So we'll now move to the polls. Before that, I would like to thank once again all the speakers of session 1, also the audience for the various questions, and of course for session 2 and session 3, feel free to raise your hands and ask the questions directly. We'll be happy to listen to your thoughts on the other topics. So you will now see appearing on your screen, if a few of you can confirm, a first poll on the key considerations to include in hydrogen certification. So we have prepared a list of statements or of elements that could be included in the certifications, and what we propose you is to rate them from 1 to 4. So 4 being that it's absolutely necessary to have them within a certification, and 1 being that it's not needed in the certification as such. So we would also be glad, even if all these elements could be in the certification, to try to use a bit the whole scale so that we can see a bit the priority of the audience. And my colleague, Dea Saigin, will comment the results of both polls in a few minutes just before session 2. Thank you. So more than half of the participants have already completed the poll. We'll just leave a couple of minutes more for the other participants to finalize. So we have now completed the first poll, and I will let my colleague Bea comment the result.
Sure. Thank you, Joseph. I think very interesting, somewhat also confirming what we've heard during the session one today. It looks like the greenhouse gas emissions, whether cradle to grave or life cycle, are key in these certification mechanisms, as well as the origin of power. I think we heard that towards the end of session one, but it seems this is an important topic that needs to be investigated further, and I hope we can do this a little bit also in session two. The color of the hydrogen seems much less important than initially thought. So the other aspects pertaining to energy and emissions are most important. We've heard today about the broader sustainability and environmental impacts that need to be addressed or that should be addressed in such mechanisms. And I think an important share of the participants have also agreed with that and mentioned this in their responses, as well as for the safety concerns. But still, there are mixed thoughts, it seems. Maybe we can move to the second poll briefly, and then we will continue with the second session of today's webinar.
Yeah, so if we may launch the second poll. So the second poll is an introduction to session two, which covers rather the challenges for the harmonization of different certification mechanisms. So here it's a multiple choice question. So we ask all participants to read carefully the 10 proposed statements or 10 proposed challenges, and to select only the top 3 of what they consider being the main priorities for the harmonization. So we will also leave to everyone 3 to 5 minutes to complete the poll. So we'll leave 1 additional minute for the audience to complete the poll, and we will then comment the results.
Okay, on the second poll results, what we see most important for the harmonization and interoperability of certification mechanisms is across 3 topics, perhaps, to summarize. 1 on the definition and standards, that's like a must, it seems, as well as the data and methodology aspects. We will be speaking later in session 3 about the stakeholder roles. So far, this is something we may seem to be overlooking, but this will definitely be emphasized at the end of this webinar, and that seems to be also an important aspect. And finally, and as we've heard also during session 1, the value chain component is critical for harmonizing different certification mechanisms. So I invite all the participants and speakers to attend the second session of today's webinar, where we will be dealing further about what it means, international harmonization and interoperability, as this is a topic of concern in the context of energy sector certifications, definitions, and standards, and definitely also a growing question, yet not a full answer or a solution is provided. And maybe we will be hearing some ideas on this during session 2 today. And with these in mind, to understand strategies, suggestions, solutions, and also to dive further into the poll 2 results, we have 4 valuable experts, speakers who will be discussing this today with us. And for that, I'd like to first invite our colleague from the International Energy Agency, Jose Miguel Bermudez, to begin with session 2.
Thank you very much, Deger. Good morning, everyone. Hope you can hear me well, because I'm testing this this new device. Hopefully there will be no problem. First of all, thanks a lot for the invitation and for giving me the opportunity to participate in this really interesting webinar. If we can go just to the next slide to start with the topic. And well, although the topic of discussion today is hydrogen certification, I thought it was good to start the intervention showing a picture of which is the current status of what we in the IEA call production of low emission hydrogen and the potential in the short, medium term. So the production of low emission hydrogen in 2020 was less than 1 million tons, practically all of it coming from fossil fuels using carbon capture, utilization and storage, covering less than 1% of the global hydrogen production, which was around 94 million tons. This is, of course, highly unsustainable, even more if we consider that hydrogen demand is expected to keep growing in the short term, both in the additional applications in industry and refining, but also in new applications motivated by the fight against climate change. However, the good news comes from the pipeline of projects for the production of low emission hydrogen that we see that is growing at a very impressive speed. So if you go to the next slide, we can see that our analysis of the current project pipeline suggests that if all the projects around the world would be realized, annual production of low emission hydrogen could reach 24 million tons by 2030, with up to 40 million tons based on electrolysis-based projects. These are pretty impressive figures if we take into account that they are equivalent to around 70% of the annual low emission hydrogen production that will be needed to meet the current climate pledges. In the case of electrolysis, this means a massive deployment of the technology, which could reach up to 240 gigawatts compared to less than 1 gigawatt today. In the next slide, please. These are all encouraging processes or progress, but there are still important challenges ahead because a planned project is not a project that we have in the pocket, right? A significant fraction of the projects that are currently under development are at advanced planning stages, but only around 4% of them are already under construction or have reached to a final investment decision. So there is still a long way to realizing this project pipeline. This slow progress on real-world implementation of the plans is a consequence of different uncertainties, for example, around demand, which makes it difficult to secure offtakes, a lack of infrastructure to deliver hydrogen to the end users, and what brings us today here, which is a lack of clarity in regulatory frameworks and in certification of hydrogen production and hydrogen transport to the end users. In addition, as we focus on this terminal, particularly on hydrogen trade, I want to mention that in our latest global hydrogen review, we performed a specific analysis on hydrogen trade projects, and the conclusion is very, very similar to overall production projects, which is they are facing the same type of barriers, with a concrete case in hydrogen trade projects that we have to add into the barriers. They need to clarify how international trade rules can apply to hydrogen and its derivatives. Next slide. Governments around the world have a critical role to play in facilitating coordinated and timely investments on hydrogen. And this means in particularly setting clear policy frameworks that are compatible across borders. This does not mean that governments will need to dictate the precise format of the traded hydrogen products, but rather to agree about the standards that are needed for environmental criteria, or that policies that are needed to incentivize end users to commit to long-term purchases and manage offtake risk. In both areas, international coordination will be essential to allow cross-border trade to emerge and to contribute to government climate pledges. As a consequence of this, standards and certification for warranting that hydrogen and its derivatives, I will refer only to hydrogen, but it's always hydrogen and its derivatives, meet those environmental criteria. So this topic of standard certification has emerged as an important issue for project developers. Investors seek upfront certainty or that the output of those projects in which they want to invest will meet the regulatory obligations, right? Which could be that a share of the total hydrogen demand comes from low emission hydrogen, or that it meets a certain threshold to be eligible for funding instruments. Moreover, there are also certain market incentives for projects that will also require standards or certification. For example, a manufacturer that anticipates a premium for a car made with low emission steel that is produced itself with low emission hydrogen. Several governments and commercial entities have taken the first step to facilitate this process of certification, proposing different levels for hydrogen production for different purposes. However, there is still a long way to go on the development and agreement of international recognized standards, and the currently proposed levels are not consistent with each other. Not all of the methodologies of these standards and labels take a life cycle approach for emission accounting. For example, some consider emissions only at the production point, while others consider the hydrogen delivered to the end users. And in certain cases, they incorporate additional criteria, such as limiting production to electrolysis using renewable electricity, or additionality criteria for the deployment of renewable production capacities. So the investments that will lead to trade of low emission hydrogen and its derivatives between countries this decade will rely on international recognition of standards and certificates. Regions that are expected to be first movers in importing will have some flexibility to determine these criteria. But dialogue with exporters will be essential to ensure the successful realization of these projects. For example, a project developer deciding whether to contract with off-takers in the EU, in Japan, in Korea, will be influenced by the risks related to meeting this intensity or emissions criteria. Therefore, importers need to enhance international dialogues and cooperation in the near term to work on ensuring compatibility between different regimes. Next slide. Facilitating the harmonization or at least the compatibility of standards and certificates and regulations will be fundamental to minimize delivery risk for project developers. Although we have to recognize that this is not an easy process. Different national objectives, national priorities, deployment targets will have an impact on the regulatory requirements that the countries will adopt, and then for in-house certification schemes can be developed. But there are some certain minimums that can be agreed internationally as the first step and facilitate interoperability between these regulations and these schemes. And these minimums can be extended over time as the market matures. Just to mention, in the previous poll, we saw clear agreements on the need of taking a life cycle approach for greenhouse gas emissions, but less agreement on other environmental criteria, perhaps in terms of water use or certain things around hydrogen derivatives. So to illustrate how we can take this approach of agreed on certain minimums and then be strengthened or expanding these minimums, I wanted to use this critical path to 2030 for low carbon and renewable hydrogen and its derivatives that was suggested in the last Breakthrough Agenda report. The report recommends governments to agree a comprehensive portfolio of international standards and associated certification schemes. And for example, in the case of standards for greenhouse gas emissions, it recommends some sort of modular approach, commencing by agreeing a methodology for calculating this greenhouse gas emissions of hydrogen production that can be later extended to the production of its derivatives or the transport to its final user. Following the same approach for certification schemes, firstly agreeing on how carbon intensity of hydrogen production can be certified, and then expanding it to conversion into its derivatives or transport. can also facilitate certain level of interoperability, while still leaving governments margin to include some additional criteria which will need themselves specific certification protocols. And well, this was just my setting of the scene, and of course, looking forward to the conversation with the rest of the panelists and the Q&A from the rest of participants in the workshop. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jose, and also mentioning the stakeholder roles a little bit in ensuring harmonization. Among the many other points you raised, indeed, the international trade requires international recognition of certification mechanisms, and I think we will hear more about those points in more detail in the coming speakers' views. So I would like to invite Prerna Bhargava, who is the assistant manager at the Department of Climate Change, Energy, the Environment and Water, Australia. So we are very interested to hear your views and the developments that are taking place in your country on this topic of hydrogen and its derivatives production.
Great, thank you very much, and I hope you can all hear me. I may just share my screen if I'm able to.
Yeah. You should be
Doesn't
able to
seem... Yes, here we go. Okay. Fantastic. So look, thank you all and good day to everyone, and thank you very much to the OECD for inviting me to speak with you today. So my name is Prerna Bhargava, and I'm currently the acting manager in the hydrogen strategy section of the Australian Government Department of Climate Change, Energy, the Environment and Water. So look, international harmonisation and interoperability is a critical but equally complex topic, and I'd like to spend the short time that I've got today trying to convey Australia's views on this topic by taking you through some of the key design principles and components that we've put into our Australian Guarantee of Origin scheme. So look, I won't dwell and won't go through the details here on this slide, but really the main point is that we've been designing this scheme for a number of years now, and our design has been based on really active participation in critical international forums that have been discussing certification, but also detailed co-design with our domestic industry. Now, most of you would be familiar that Australia is seeking to be a net exporter of renewable and clean hydrogen. And so it is because of that, we're very vulnerable to the differing needs of the different markets domestically and internationally. And so for that reason, it's been really critical that our Guarantee of Origin scheme supports investment and market growth for both domestic and international markets. So as people have already mentioned, different countries and markets will have different needs, and that's, I think, normal and for any industry of this kind. But really, to support a global hydrogen market, we think that it's important that consumers or purchasers can easily compare hydrogen that is produced from different areas of the world. But to do this, first and foremost, we need an internationally aligned emissions accounting methodology. Now, as others have already mentioned, the International Partnership for Hydrogen and Fuel Cells in the Economy, or the IPHE, has really been the leading and advanced international multilateral government-to-government forum for developing and agreeing an internationally agreed emissions accounting methodology for various hydrogen production pathways and energy carriers. So we really feel that it's important for any certification scheme that's being developed either in different countries or by different industry groups to really use the IPHE as a starting point for calculating emissions under its scheme. And over the last few years, we've been pleased to see the growing amount of influence and international backing that the IPHE has been given. And as a result, the IPHE is now looking to extend some of its work to move beyond just the emissions accounting methodologies and to start exploring some of the more complex components of certification, such as how others have talked about already, how can we take into account ESG requirements or sustainability requirements beyond just the black and white emissions intensity. So going back to what Australia's been developing, so the IPHE has really been where we've been doing most of our work internationally and has really been the basis of the work we've done on our own domestic scheme. So our Guarantee of Origin scheme is an emissions accounting framework. It's intended to measure, verify, and track critical information about a product, such as hydrogen, for example, the emissions intensity, across its life cycle from production to end use. But we also think it's important that this information stays with the product, and we refer to this as a provenance approach, meaning we don't think that Guarantee of Origin certificate should be able to be traded to allow, hydrogen that hasn't been produced with those attributes to be able to claim those attributes with a traded certificate. And like others have also spoken, we do also recognize that emissions intensity alone is not enough. We really believe consumers should have a choice in the hydrogen they choose to purchase and support based on a number of different attributes that might be important to them, such as water use, production methodology, type of renewable electricity, and the like. So our scheme is really based on the idea of transparency across the supply chain, and our scheme will allow Guarantee of Origin certificates to display information across a number of different attributes. And I'll show you shortly what one of these certificates may look like. But we also recognize, and as we've discussed already at length, we're well off a global definition or threshold for what is considered renewable or green or clean hydrogen, if that's even possible. But our Guarantee of Origin scheme really is not about branding. It's not about labeling. It's not about providing a color or providing, some sort of a stamp on a certificate. Because, at the end of the day, I think our perspective is, for such a nascent industry, what's in a name? What does green even mean? They can be 50 shades of green, as it were. And so our scheme is really about providing objective, evidenced information about a product. And we think that this is useful not just for consumers who demand a product that might meet, a whole suite of different requirements, but also that we think of it as a way to support producers that are going above and beyond to reduce their emissions or increase their sustainability, practices that usually come at an increased cost, and that they're undertaking across their value chain, to allow these producers or these industries to be valued for that effort by being able to recoup some of the costs that they put into undertaking these processes with a higher premium that can be sought with their hydrogen. So in order to create sophisticated markets for hydrogen, we're proposing to create a certificate here in Australia that includes a variety of information. And I do apologise for how small this may be on some of the screens. But here you can really see what basically a mock-up for a Guarantee of Origin for hydrogen may look like. So it includes the emissions, the information that you would expect to see. So for example, the emissions intensity of a product at a kilogram per kilogram level, but it also has detailed information about the batch production details, electricity inputs, and also, a breakdown of the emissions based on the product stage or the component of the life cycle. So what we believe is important is that the information on these certificates would be publicly available on a register, but that different information could be restricted to different users depending on sensitivity. As I've mentioned, what is core for this is the idea of transparency. And we also expect that end use details will also be included in the certificate. So really, I guess in summary, it was really a short presentation, but I think our views are really about there is complexity in reaching a definition or a standard, but we don't actually feel that that is as big of an obstacle to face at this stage, that the work that the IPHE has done to start that international conversation around methodologies for emissions accounting have helped countries like Australia and like many others who have leveraged the IPHE's work to move forward. These are really the fundamental components of this. I would also note that Australia's Guarantee of Origin scheme is not intended to be limited to just hydrogen. We are looking to expand this scheme to other products in the future. And our scheme also does include a long-term tracking mechanism for renewable electricity here as well. So I would say from our perspective, given that we're an exporter, but given that we also are in a region where we see a lot of economies with different abilities and different capacities to participate in global low emissions markets, we really think that we need to be able to support growth of a global market without setting restrictive requirements at this stage, but focusing on the components that we can feasibly agree and continuing conversations on some of those more complex components and identifying areas that are best for us to choose to, have some sort of international consensus, but still be able to give markets an ability to pick and choose products based on what they need. Our scheme is intended to be flexible and adaptable over time because, the global kind of renewable hydrogen or clean hydrogen industry is only really just beginning in earnest. And we expect that over years, as the industry matures, there'll be more and more that we learn about different ways to produce lower emissions hydrogen or different components about how to appropriately calculate some of these emissions. Some of the lessons we've seen over time around the ability to calculate, say, fugitive emissions, our ability to do that now compared to, say, 20, 30 years ago has really shown that we need to be flexible and adaptable as some of these industries change. And so that's really been the core of what we've been designing here. But those are just some views on some very short views on what Australia's been sort of looking to do. And I really look forward to what has already been a really interesting discussion with some of the other panelists as well here today. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Prerna. This was excellent. I took a few notes, maybe to repeat, but because they are very important, that's why I want to do that. You mentioned the importance of the internationally acknowledged emission accounting methodology, and the example which you've shown also from Australia, including all the life cycle stages, I think was important, and that these methodologies should also adapt to the transformation of the industries. You've also given the example of the IPHE approach, which we will, I think, hear more in session 3. And finally, a few characteristics that I took note of from the guarantees of origin that you've shown on the importance of transparency. And so it's not only about the color, labeling, etc., but that you also highlighted that such mechanisms should not be reflecting only the needs of the consumers, but also provide benefits to the producers. So all of this was very helpful, and I think there will be questions to your very interesting presentation. Now, let's move on with the IREC standard. So Jared Brostowski, who's the managing director from that organization or the foundation, which has been working on the renewable energy certification and in that broader sense on the power system. And I understand also there is a growing stream of work on hydrogen-related issues. So we are very interested to hear his presentation now.
Great. Thank you, everyone, for the opportunity to speak today. It's a pleasure to be here. You can actually just go to the first slide, so click already, because what we are talking about is really the origin of hydrogen and the origin of a lot of products, and that is electricity. So I'm going to start this short presentation by discussing the origins of electricity tracking, the guarantee of origin for electricity that's been developed in Europe and the US primarily over the last 25 years. It's been developed as the result of hundreds of thousands of stakeholder hours, meetings, stakeholders, governments, private industries working together to come up with voluntary tracking standards for renewable electricity. And we've done that over a long time period, improving this method over time. So some previous speakers said, this is part of that building blocks. The tracking system for hydrogen is building upon the tracking system of, for example, electricity. And I couldn't agree with that more. Electricity plus computers is data. Electricity plus metal ore is aluminum. Electricity plus water at its simplest form is hydrogen. So to just secondarily ignore kind of this hydrogen the electricity discussion, or put it as a secondary thought, the electricity discussion when it comes to hydrogen is a mistake, because we need to recognize for the last 25 years, end users have been making claims to renewable electricity. And you see that through the mechanism on the screen, very simplified discussion, where a certificate is given to a renewable electricity site and it's consumed by an end user. Next slide. But the reality is, for a hydrogen tracking system to work, we need what is called a full disclosure system. These full disclosure systems provide certificates to all forms of electricity generation, allow end users to claim all forms of electricity generation, not just for themselves, but potentially also for their products. And this is where we're really moving towards. We're moving beyond corporate social responsibility in the form of corporate accounting to really moving towards a product type of accounting framework. The accounting of an individual ton of aluminum, an individual unit of hydrogen. And we see this legislatively around the world with the development of mechanisms like CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, that is really looking at not the organization, but the product they're delivering and the product that is entering into various borders. Now, this already shows that a tracking system itself is not a statement of opinion, it's a statement of fact. And this fact is very, very important to say that there is a user that is procuring coal on the grid. And it is a fact-based, technology agnostic statement to say someone is procuring wind and someone is procuring coal. This tracking system itself is not responsible for making a value judgment. Next slide. And we see that there are fundamentally three major standards for renewable electricity tracking around the world. The one is the North American standard that encompasses the US and North America. I won't talk about that a lot today. The other is the European Guarantee of Origin standard, which is organized by the Association of Issuing Bodies. We heard about this previously. And the third is the IREC standard, the organization that I'm working for, that provides a standard that governments can get involved with and implement on a voluntary basis. Next slide. So you'll see that these are the issuers within the IREC standard framework. Many of them are government entities, grid operators, for-profit and nonprofit entities. And these are all organizations that have voluntarily chosen to adhere to the international standard prepared by the IREC Standard Foundation and other market facilitators and implement the standard in their national jurisdiction. So we talk about local implementation, but international standardization. And that's no different than the European case, which you can click again. This is an overview of the European Guarantee of Origin issuers, the issuers for the electricity certificates for Guarantee of Origin in Europe. And the dark blue countries are the ones that adhere to the Association of Issuing Bodies, European Energy Certificate Scheme or Standard, whichever way you want to call it. So even in this case, it's very similar to the IREC model, where you've got national issuers that are governments, grid operators, nonprofit entities and for-profit entities that are voluntarily appointed to adhere to an international standard. So again, you're talking about international standardization, but local implementation with the issuers. And next slide. Yeah, you can already see that there is this transition to gas and to hydrogen certification. So this image in front of you, where it doesn't show all of the countries being filled in, that's because not every European member state has appointed yet an issuing body for gas. Only some of them have. So you see on the electricity side, every country has an issuing body for electricity. But on the gas side, it's only starting to come across now that there are being nationally appointed issuers for gas. And you see those nationally appointed issuers there. And also you see the ones that are already Association of Issuing Body members in light green. So some of them are both the issuing body for electricity and the issuing body for gas. And in some countries, there's a separate issuing body for electricity and a separate one for gas. Next slide. And the one fundamental aspect when we're talking about, in particular, the terminology aspects is the difference between a tracking scheme and a certification scheme. And I've been very clear until now in talking only about a tracking scheme. And oftentimes we hear a lot about certification, tracking, verification, all these things kind of mixed together, but they are fundamentally different activities. The first, of course, tracking scheme is based upon a statement of fact, technology agnostic, non-preferential, fact-based, and it removes opinions. It's stackable information, so that means electricity can go into hydrogen, hydrogen can go into another product, carbon dioxide removals can go into hydrogen together with electricity into hydrogen. All of these things need to be able to work together to create a really robust hydrogen certification without opinions. The other is a certification scheme where there can be, of course, clearly defined requirements associated with technology, location, use of water, CO2 content. All of these things are very, very important. But it's important to know that a tracking certificate can adhere multiple certification schemes. One of them could be, for example, for certify. One of them could be for a TÜV-SÜD standard. One of them could be applicable for the Japanese market or the South Korean market. So there can be multiple certifications on a fact-based instrument, but it is the fact-based instrument that is delivering that proof of ownership. Next slide. Because the important thing to recognize is hydrogen is super complex. And if you want a hydrogen tracking system that is going to be able to cover the entire space, you need to do that in an technology agnostic and fast-paced way. Because if we're talking about hydrogen and hydrogen derivatives, we need to look at CCUS and CDR, carbon dioxide removals. Methane intensity, we need to consider electricity. And on electricity alone, we need to consider if that's going to be based upon an annual, monthly, 15-minute accounting period. It's not necessarily simple. So a lot of these things need to work together, and that's why we need to separate out the facts from the opinions. And then you can start determining what type of opinions can be used to adhere to national legislation and national requirements. But first, we need to understand what we're actually dealing with. What is the ingredient list of that hydrogen? Next slide. So you see, for example, with carbon dioxide removals, the EU is already looking into carbon dioxide removals. It's definitely going to play a role when it comes to hydrogen as well. What is then the price discovery between a carbon dioxide removal ton and a point source reduction ton? What if that point source reduction was for mineralization? What if it went to EOR? All of these things are going to play an important role when it comes to determining the carbon content of the associated hydrogen. And as a result, we don't want to make a decision about this is necessarily the only carbon footprint available. We're going to allow that to be allocated on top of the certification itself by other entities. I'll talk about that in a bit more detail. Next slide. And then, of course, you need to look at other aspects. For example, the electricity. Can the electricity be booked on a 15-minute basis or an hourly basis, an annual basis, or a quarterly basis? This was already a discussion within the RFMBO criteria within Europe, and is definitely going to be a discussion down the line as we start moving towards kind of more granular accounting frameworks. So we've already done 24/7 accounting, renewable issuance and accounting for example, Google with their Chile data center. But we've also worked, for example, with BMW and Emirati Global Aluminum on the creation of renewably produced aluminum from Emirati Global Aluminum being delivered to BMW. So a lot of these things, it's not necessarily that we want to come up with the solutions. We don't. But we want to come up with a clear way of defining the facts. So at least we've got a fair analysis of what actually took place for other entities to make determinations associated with applicability or not, potentially to various legislations. Next slide. Talking about cross-border trade, this was a recent report that was published from June 2022. Will Saudi Arabia, I think this is a great report. It was created between Germany and Saudi Arabia, but there is one sentence where it says, the certification will be based on voluntary schemes supervised by the European member states. Will Saudi Arabia develop a guarantee of origin scheme? Yes, they will. We are in discussion with the national authorities on the development of this scheme as well. Will it be supervised by the European Union? I think that's very unlikely. I think what's more likely is that there's going to be mutual recognition between the various certification schemes, because I think it's unlikely that the European Union would allow Saudi Arabia to reverse supervise their national systems. And I don't think it's likely that Europe is going to be supervising every national system that they're going to be coordinating with. So there is going to be some role for kind of just a mutual recognition and independent verifiers. Next step. And of course, we're also looking at a huge investment in hydrogen as well. This is from December 8, 2022. 900 million euros is going into the development of renewable hydrogen, renewably produced, quote unquote, green hydrogen. not inside Europe. This is all tenders for generation of hydrogen outside of Europe. And you can see within their tender documents that they are requiring EACs and REC systems to be used and canceled in the generation of that hydrogen and delivery of that hydrogen. Next slide. So the IRIC standard is creating a framework of various criteria that's interoperable, because we recognize that hydrogen certification in its own is not the end all be all. We need to recognize that it comes from electricity. It's potentially using methane if it's done with steam methane reformation. Potentially there's carbon dioxide removals and point source reduction that's also included. So all of these various elements need to work together and be certified to recognize kind of the various boundaries and stakeholders there. Again, not that the IRIC standard is coming up with any opinions, because we are a fact-based technology agnostic organization, but at least providing the ingredient labels for other stakeholders, national governments, authorities, and applicability standards to be verified. Next slide. And then the last slide that I have for now is measuring with multiple sticks, because the problem is that even if you define a tracking system or a certification system adherent to a specific regulatory structure, even within the EU, we are currently measuring with multiple sticks. You've got the RED 3 criteria, you've got the CBAM criteria, you've got the RFMBO criteria. All of these are potentially measuring hydrogen, because hydrogen falls under each of these depending upon what various derivatives and what the end use is, but they potentially fall under all three of those. And the ways for measuring the carbon content are different in all three of those legislations. And this is within a single jurisdiction. So if you're talking about hydrogen that's going to be exported to South Korea, to Japan, to Europe, and to other locations, it could be that there's many different criteria associated with how the carbon content needs to be calculated for that unit of hydrogen. And as a result, we see carbon calculations, but also other types of applicability standards much more in that certification framework. So there can be certifying bodies that say this unit of hydrogen, based upon these facts, based upon this criteria, has this specific carbon content. And as we know, if the boundaries are different on a carbon calculation, the carbon content itself will also be different. So depending upon the boundary, depending upon the scope, depending upon the use and the definitions, a single unit of hydrogen could have multiple different CO2 figures, depending upon the certification entity that is kind of verifying it. So it could be that for applicability in Japan, it needs to use this calculation and has this CO2 figure, but for applicability, for example, in South Korea, it has a different CO2 calculation, and as a result, results in a different CO2 figure, even though it's the same unit of hydrogen. It's just a different calculation methodology. There's nothing wrong with that. But I think it's just we need to recognize that there is a lot of variability here. And as we're trying to work on something that is going to be applicable on a global market, flexibility is key. And that's our primary message. We need to be flexible, especially in the next 5 years, to allow these things to take place and be developed and not create rules that are too rigid, that it is the certification that is stopping some form of export. That would be really, really poor. So I think flexibility is really important and makes certification just an easy step that can be organized to adhere to various markets. That's the end of my presentation. So thank you everyone for your time and attention. I'd be happy to take any questions you have, and thank you as well to the OECD for inviting me to speak today.
Thank you very much, Jared. And a few points which you shared that I found important to repeat. The full disclosure, you mentioned the flexibility as a key point to avoid setting rigid rules at an early market creation stage. I think it was the examples you gave on the cross-border trade and tenders for hydrogen imports were very interesting, especially you highlighted the role of independent verifiers. And the example which you gave from the European Union on the multiple ways of measuring standards, regulations, legislations available for carbon emissions was, I think, an interesting example. And then that already expands to even more complex availability of methodologies across many other countries that will be trading hydrogen with each other. And that remains as still a question, I think, which we can discuss in the Q&A part of the session. And now our last speaker from the Hydrogen Council, Daria Nochevnik. I will leave the floor to you for your intervention. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And again, thank you to our colleagues in OECD for this kind invitation. It's great to see a number of familiar faces here today. And I think that, Jared, thank you for the presentation you made earlier. It's a perfect segue to some of the insights that I would like to share with you today. To those of you who may not know us, the Hydrogen Council is a global coalition of CEOs. So we represent over 150 industrial leaders in hydrogen across geographies from Europe and Africa to the Americas and Asia Pacific. So we're global. We are delighted to be cooperating closely with our colleagues in IEA, as well as IRENA and IPHE. And within the council, we have a dedicated program, which is titled Hydrogen Sustainability Program. And in this program, we work on supporting the development of common global standards, including the standard methodology for assessing all hydrogen production, the carbon footprint of all hydrogen production pathways, as well as transportation pathways from well to gate. Many of you know that there is an ISO standard that is on the way and hopefully will be launched by COP28 in UAE later this year. We also work very closely, and we are currently finalizing a report on paving the way for mutual recognition between certification schemes. So this is a topic that has been mentioned earlier today a few times, and also earlier by Jared and other speakers in the prior sessions. So I will elaborate on this in particular and talk a little bit about the context and drawing on the previous presentations and some of the key solutions that we seek to offer together with our partners. Next slide, please. So as was discussed previously, certification is indeed an important instrument for the development of the hydrogen economy. We need to make sure that we distinguish clearly between certificates and standards, so we can have standards developed at global level or at national level, in particular when it comes to the methodologies for assessing, again, the carbon footprint or other sustainability attributes, which can include the use of water or land. And these methodologies can differ, and certification schemes and certificates are used to evidence that certain sustainability attributes of hydrogen are indeed pertinent to a specific plant or unit of hydrogen. So certification is due to play a key role in evidencing the sustainability attributes in a manner that is credible and consistent. And we also see a key role for certification to support the bankability of some of the projects and some of the project proposals that are being put on the table by way of enabling access to compliance markets. And something that we heard earlier today is that there is a plethora of different compliance markets that emerge across jurisdictions as benchmarks for clean and help creating trust and for helping consumers signal their demand for hydrogen and ultimately enabling consumer choice. So on what type of hydrogen they would like to consume and whether they would like to use this hydrogen for compliance purposes or for reporting and disclosure purposes. Next slide, please. So as we have heard earlier today, largely we can talk about two key purposes, if you like, so for which certification schemes can be designed to serve. One is regulatory compliance, and the other one is reporting and disclosure, because of course the certificates can also be used for the purposes of ESG reporting or corporate reporting that a number of market participants seek to pursue and do on a regular basis already currently. Next slide, please. So we have launched an exercise where we looked at the different compliance frameworks for hydrogen derivatives. And I think, again, here, it's key to bear in mind that certification is a means to an end, right? It's not like there are different certification schemes, there are different policy frameworks that are designed to incentivize fuel switching across different industries. And then you can use certification schemes for the purposes of complying with those policy frameworks, right? So here you just have a snapshot of different policy frameworks targeting different types of end users, from transport and maritime to aviation, also the ETS scheme and the framework for FMBOs in Europe, to the emerging mandatory markets in Japan and Korea. Most recently, some of you may know that there is actually a new carbon pricing scheme that has been introduced in Japan. So there are multiple different instruments targeting different end-use sectors, and in order to and certification can be used as a means to an end, effectively, to for market participants to be able to comply with these instruments. Next slide, please. And we see, and like was mentioned by previous speakers, that even though there may be these mandatory markets may necessitate, or frameworks may necessitate, evidencing some specific metrics or specific sustainability attributes, the way these metrics and attributes can be assessed can differ. And that, for example, includes the scope of the greenhouse gas emissions assessment methodologies, but also the types of social or environmental impact that may be required to evidence under some specific compliance markets. Next slide, please. So we see that indeed there will be, and they are already, and there is a number of schemes and a number of governments are designing their own certification schemes for hydrogen. And this is, of course, very welcome. And at the same time, as was mentioned by previous speakers, we see that there is a danger in having ultimately lack of fungibility between these certificates and de facto market fragmentation because of unless these certificate schemes can talk to each other, and that can create a barrier to cross-border trade. Next slide, please. So in order to bridge that and to address that barrier, we do think that this concept of mutual recognition, enabling mutual recognition between schemes, is absolutely key, which is the reason why we have, and we are right now in the process of finalizing our roadmap and checklist. And this project and this report and the roadmap and the checklist are really designed to provide practical solutions to the design of the schemes, and that could be used by relevant competent authorities across the countries that seek to establish their own national certification schemes with the view to pursuing and streamlining that mutual recognition. Next slide, please. This is something that was discussed previously, but definitely just to highlight some key elements in terms of certification scheme design and system design. We'll look at some of the key elements relating to the metrics and methodologies, chain of custody decisions, or the auditing, reporting, scheme governance rules. And in particular, we're zooming in on how to make sure that the certification schemes are credible, they're trustworthy, and they ultimately fit for purpose. So we'll lay out some of the key design features that can be put in place to enable robust governance and oversight structures to ensure that double counting is absolutely avoided. To help basically ensuring that the design of the schemes builds on some credible global standards that emerge to assess the various sustainability attributes of hydrogen. And last but certainly not least, deciding on what are the sort of attributes that can be put in place in a mandatory versus voluntary way, building on the existing common methodologies to assessing those. Next slide, please. So the two products that we'll be launching soon is this roadmap designed to advance mutual recognition for some of the existing and emerging schemes, and a checklist which is meant to be a very practical tool for the entities that seek to design their new national schemes as a guidebook, if you like, on the sort of design features that can be put in place in order to enable mutual recognition. And we're also working on, and we'll be releasing Hydrogen Certification 101 document, which is designed to lay out the terminology and the key terms and concepts that are used in the certification space. Now, I realize that the time is short, but perhaps very briefly in the next slide, I would like to refer to the work that we are launching with the IATCP, So within the IATCP, we will be launching a dedicated certification task where we would like to take the work that we have done in the framework of our project further and actually build a community of practice with the relevant experts and test some of the key findings from the roadmap and the checklist and create a platform for scheme developers, both independent ones and those that the scheme developers at national level and relevant competent authorities to come together and debate some of the key issues that they're facing in designing their scheme and how those solutions to mutual recognition can be adopted in practice. I'll stop here and I would be very happy to take any questions. And again, a big thank you to our OECD colleagues for organizing this exchange. Thank you.
Thank you, Daria. And just before you leave, there is one question directly addressed to you about the toolbox for policymakers on harmonization of certification schemes that you will be releasing or publishing. Is that already available, or is that the one which you mentioned on the tradable schemes?
Yes, so we will be releasing the roadmap and the checklist next month.
Okay, thank you very much, Daria. That's very helpful. In view of the various points that have been raised in the chat and some of the questions we received directly from some of the participants, I've actually want to elaborate on 3 distinct points with Prerna, Jared, and Jose, if possible in that order. And in a very short amount of time that we have left, as we are exceeding our time budget slowly, I would like to turn to Prerna about their national experiences and as an exporting or potential exporting country in the future for hydrogen and its derivative products. Many speakers have shared the view on the complexity and the versatility of hydrogen, its products, logistics, and end-use sectors. So when we think of this complexity, how can we still be ensuring some level of harmonization, speaking with each other of these various certification schemes? Do you have some suggestions on that one? I would like to look a bit at the solutions, because at least at the Q&A, as we've outlined quite a bit of the problems. So if you could elaborate on that from your country perspective, industry perspective, that would be very helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I guess the approach that we've taken is our partners in terms of, people or I guess regions that have stood out as early markets for Australian hydrogen. I guess fundamental to the way we've designed our guarantee of origin scheme is this idea of co-design. So it's about collaborating early, understanding the needs of those markets. And I think, when it comes to international harmonization or consensus on some of these topics, I think it's quite easy. And if we look at some of the work, in IPHE or ISO, it's quite easy to agree things at a higher level. But I think one thing that we found is that really a lot of the devil is in the detail with some of these things. So while we can set out high level approaches to accounting emissions, really, small components like metering and measuring actually have an enormous impact on the end outcome. So as an exporting country with so many possible export markets, we've been really taking an approach to engage both multilaterally but also bilaterally with these key markets to understand their specific concerns. And we've tried to create our scheme in a way that can be flexible and adaptable to these differing needs while keeping some of the core principles of having something that's high integrity that reduces or eliminates double counting of claims, where we try to push and influence the idea of, reducing, I guess, double counting of renewable electricity claims when you've got differing approaches on how you measure that. So, and I think also, we've only just really started our journey. I think we've only really tested what the IPHE has done up until the production gate. I think our next stage of work is looking at how we can test some of these methodologies and work with partners on that idea of interoperability of IT systems as well, and interoperability of and an understanding of how emissions past the production gate are accepted by different countries and how they're measured. So there's no easy solution, but I guess what we have found valuable is engaging and making co-design a fundamental part of how we've developed our scheme, not to develop it in a silo, but really to go out consistently, probably much to the dismay of our stakeholders who, you know, we've been talking to sort of a lot over the last few years, but really talking to every component and every person who has some stake in our guarantee of origin scheme. And that's really helped us understand the key points where we have to remain flexible, where we have to remain adaptable, and that different countries will just have different needs, and has helped us design it in a way that we can bed down certain concepts early on, but we can keep other components fairly open and fairly amenable to different needs. So hopefully that sort of answers your question.
No, definitely, and it's very comprehensive. Yet I've taken note of this point which you raised about designing these mechanisms together and understanding the needs of different markets. So flexibility and adaptability to overcome the versatility and complexity characteristics, I think, of the hydrogen sector is perhaps a key point from your response. And I want to turn to Jared because during your presentation, you raised quite a number of issues, and I understand there will still remain divergences, differences in these certification mechanisms. So the question goes along the lines, how these can impact the international harmonization, and could we still claim a certain level of harmonization can be reached given the potential divergences, differences that will remain in the certification mechanisms? How can we?
Sure. Well, actually, Daria, I see that you're raising your hand, so I'd be happy to defer to you quickly if you'd like to give an initial response, and then I can jump in as well.
Go ahead, and I'll follow up. Thanks, Jen.
Okay, no problem. So I do think that it is critical that we focus on two elements. One, flexibility, and the other is that it's based upon at least a layer of fact-based elements. Those are very important aspects because while CO2, and I gave that example before, there's going to be different boundaries, calculation methodologies, and we're not going to come to standards here on an international basis anytime soon. So you could even say that CO2 itself is going to be a certification layered on top of the facts about how that hydrogen was generated. And it's going to be extremely important if, for example, the European stakeholders say that only electricity that was created within 1 hour needs to be matched to the hydrogen generation, and it needs to be within a certain framework, then you have to have that fact-based element on the certificate itself. And all of those elements need to be clearly defined to know if you're going to be adherent to European legislation. And that's likely going to be quite a bit different than Japanese legislation. So especially for export markets, when you see this a lot in the Middle East, it's going to be quite important to be flexible and to recognize that there isn't any single mechanism that potentially is going to be applicable for all the various elements. And as such, we try to want to reduce this and distill this down to what can be observed factually based upon with auditors and verifiers and issued. And on top of that, we can add additional criteria such as certifications, CO2 figures, all these other various elements as well, which are extremely critical for adherence to a number of regulatory structures around the world. So I'm not saying that these certifications themselves as kind of additional values on top of the facts are not important. They're extremely important, but we just need to separate out those two. And the other aspect is not necessarily to overregulate certification as an element in the next 5 years. There's going to be, in the coming 5 years, a huge amount of transition nationally around the world. And we just have to see how things fall and how it develops and how things are moving in a direction over a 5-year period. So having flexibility doesn't mean that we don't have well-defined regulatory structures and well-defined systems that are based upon kind of internationally recognized mechanisms. But it does mean we're not mandating that a single mechanism is the only mechanism that can be used, because that could be constraining and it could eventually affect as well the ability to export to various markets in a cost-effective and robust way. So just saying, not over-regulating a lot of these at the beginning, having quite a bit of flexibility, and separating out the facts from opinions are the 3 core elements, I would say there.
Thank you, Jared. And very briefly, Daria, if possible, because I have one last question to Jose.
Yes, thank you. If I can just comment on this very briefly, I think taking a step back, it really is helpful to make sure that we avoid, because this is a complex issue, just to avoid confusion. There will be, and there are already different certification schemes that are emerging, that are being developed at national level by government agencies or governments. There are different voluntary schemes that are also being developed in parallel, and this is helpful, and they can be taken up and used, for example, for compliance purposes and or for voluntary reporting and disclosure purposes. When we talk about flexibility, what does it mean in practice? So having looked at the design of different schemes and how they emerge, we see that there is really a crucial need to define some of the fundamental design principles of a given scheme. How do you make sure that, again, double counting is avoided? What are the type of methodologies that you use to calculate the carbon footprint? Because even if in jurisdiction A, the CO2 footprint of hydrogen to be qualified as, let's say, sustainable is 2 kilos of CO2 equivalent per kilo of hydrogen, and you have in jurisdiction B the same very threshold of 2 kilos, but the methodologies that are used to calculate this, these thresholds are different, those two thresholds are not comparable, right? Certification scheme doesn't answer all these questions. It just, a certificate evidences that certain unit of hydrogen has certain carbon footprints and other sustainability features, and it provides you transparency on how what was the chain of custody, how the ownership of that unit of hydrogen, and together with the sustainability attributes, has been changing along the supply chain as there were transactions of selling and purchasing the given unit of hydrogen, right? So it's meant to evidence sustainability attributes and help and allow you to offer some tracking solutions, giving transparency on sort of chain of custody. So maybe just to take a step back, I think that really when we talk about flexibility, there will be, and what we envisage is the design, in terms of the design of the scheme, is that there will be some plug-in features that would be specific to different jurisdictions. So you can have plug-in features for compliance markets, let's say in the EU, in Japan, in Korea, but the core fundamental design principles, we believe it would be really beneficial to have more common agreement on these core design features in order to make sure that the schemes are really credible and trustworthy and deliver on what they promise to deliver. Because we have some examples and some learnings from the biofuels world, which we don't want to have repeated. And again, and we also need to consider that we cannot draw parallels and let's say pretend that the world of hydrogen is exactly the same as the world of renewable power, because an electron is an electron in terms of the physical properties. However you produce an electron, it remains an electron when you inject it in the grid. When it comes to quality, fuel quality, hydrogen can have different levels of purity. Its physical properties change if you inject it or if you blend it. So we have to consider those features and make sure that we draw on the learnings, both from the biofuels world and from the renewable power world. And I'm stopping here. Thank you.
Thank you, Daria. Jose, just before we go to the next session, I want to elaborate a little bit together with you on one of the points which you mentioned during your presentation about the role of importers in ensuring harmonization. You mentioned they must enhance international dialogue and collaboration in support of ensuring comparability. Could you please elaborate a little bit of what you meant with that? I think that would be also helpful for the stakeholder roles discussion coming soon.
Sure, happy to do so. So I think this comes a bit in line also with the previous speaker said, no, and particularly about how the roles or the objectives of different countries may tailor their regulations, and perhaps their objectives may end up over-regulating or requiring too harsh environmental standards from the very beginning in a nascent market. This can create challenges for the exporting countries if they need to meet very strict criteria on one region, and that may block trade routes to those regions. So I think it's critically important that the countries that are aiming to import hydrogen in this very, very nascent market, even more if we consider hydrogen, international hydrogen trade, which is not a nascent market, is basically an inexistent market today, apart from certain derivatives, but not for energy uses. It's really important that they approach and they have an open dialogue with exporting countries to understand which are the barriers that they are facing, which are the risks that they are facing, and whether the development of these very strict regulations can end up blocking the trade routes to these importing countries. If some other countries that will be importing as well will have very, very low, let's say, initial standards or initial environmental criteria. And as well, they need to work together in certain minimums. And just let me put an example. A country can agree that they will import a hydrogen which has a carbon footprint at its production stage of 3 grams of CO2 per gram of hydrogen, whereas other country may have the same level and then add other criteria. Let's say the additionality, like in the case of the EU, or let's say the temporal correlations. All these things are okay, but if at least they can agree on the common methodology for the greenhouse gas emission, a certificate that allows an exporter to export its hydrogen to the country that only requires the 3 grams of CO2 per gram of hydrogen will be valuable for the country that adds on top the other criteria as well. Of course, they will need to find ways to certificate those other criteria, but at least this interoperability on the greenhouse gas emission can be facilitated. And I think the work that the IPHE has put forward and all the efforts that are being done now with the ISO will have harder recognition, higher impact on facilitating the growth of the hydrogen market, right? So I think it's important for importing and exporting countries to have this dialogue and to make sure that on those barely minimums, there is a global agreement. I'm not speaking about the thresholds, I'm speaking on how these thresholds can be certified, tracked, and allow this interoperability, at least in those barely minimums.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And I will summarize and conclude at the very end. So I'll leave now the floor to Geraldine Ang, also from the CEFIN program, to lead and moderate the session on the stakeholder roles.
Thank you so much, Dare, and welcome everyone to the last and third session of today's very, very interesting webinar. My name is Geraldine, and I co-lead the CEFIN program as Dare just introduced me. It's been really a rich discussion. What I would suggest is for those of you who are actively listening, I encourage you to turn your video on for that last webinar before lunch or evening, depending on where you're connecting. So we've heard a lot already, you know, on the need to progress on green hydrogen standards and certification to build trust in the market, to ensure compliance. We've heard it from Thomas earlier and from many other speakers. And this is critical to demonstrate that low carbon hydrogen fulfills criteria such as cradle to gate, carbon dioxide equivalent, life cycle CO2 equivalent. I think you've raised that in the poll. Critical to avoid greenwashing, to ensure sustainability and the environmental integrity of hydrogen production across the value chain using life cycle analysis. But like Jose from the IEA noted, we're not there yet. There's a wide number of certification mechanisms, whether international, domestic, regulatory, voluntary, led by governments or industry associations or IOs. And so that leads to market fragmentation. I think many of you have highlighted, you know, Daria just now, Samuel earlier. And so reaching the consensus on definition standards, harmonizing the data, the guarantees of origin criteria, amongst many challenges, looks like it's critical to facilitate the development of low carbon hydrogen to decarbonize. But there comes the question of how can we coordinate stakeholders to achieve that? And I did hear Jared and Jose and Prerna also calling for, you know, stringency, but also flexibility, tailoring the regulations to country circumstances, interoperability. So how can we build stakeholder coordination in that very fragmented context, that emerging area? How can we foster international dialogue between governments, public and private actors? So the aim of this session is really to further the discussion that many of you have raised already on the key stakeholders around hydrogen certification schemes, their roles, and maybe how can we strengthen the governance and the capacity around certification. So I'm very pleased to welcome three excellent speakers. Laurent Anthony, who's the Executive Director-elect of the International Partnership for Hydrogen and Fuel Cells in the Economy, IPHE, who needs no introduction. Axel Dombrowski, Director of Innovation and Digitalization at DNV, and Tudor Florea, who's a Policy Advisor on Hydrogen, Green Technologies and Energy Storage in the French Ministry of Energy Transition. In the interest of time, to ensure we have a good conversation, I will ask each three speakers to limit their opening presentations to 7 minutes maximum, so we can have time for conversation and a Q&A. So for now, let me hand it over to Laurent. Laurent, the floor is yours if you want to share your presentation.
Okay. Then I will share my presentation because I thought you have it. Okay, it's fine. You have it. No?
Yeah, all good.
Okay, so yes, good afternoon or good morning, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First, thank you very much for inviting me to giving that presentation on behalf of IPHE. So to be short, I think many things have already been said. If I can move. No, can you, next slide, please. Yes, so just a quick work. IPHE has been mentioned several times this morning, but just to give you a recall, what is IPHE? IPHE is a government-to-government partnership created now 20 years ago. And the idea is really first to share information at the government level, to inform also about future government policies. But the first point is also to foster collaboration in order to be able to create a hydrogen economy. And among different activities within IPHE, as you can see, 21 countries, plus the European Commission, and we are these also to just mention to foster that collaboration on critical topics, or at least on important topics that we see that international collaboration is key, as nobody can do it alone. And I think one maybe keyword is that, of course, everyone here wants to develop hydrogen economy, but we may have similar key drivers, but the key drivers are balanced, are weighted depending on unique national circumstances. So not every country will have the same policy, the same strategy, because they have different national circumstances, maybe geopolitical, for instance. So the idea here on the different working groups, I will just focus on regulation codes and standards and different task forces related to our topic today. And that is first this, how can we agree to have a common methodology for calculating the greenhouse gas emissions? And then the next step is to work on certification mechanisms. Next slide, please. So regarding regulation code and standards, usually used RCS, we've released now 1.5 years ago a compendium, as we thought that there are already many existing standards on all the hydrogen value chain, but there may be some gaps. So the idea was, can we identify these gaps and then make a focus, I would say, helping, supporting some international standardization organization working on these specific topics. And we just have chosen last year 2 specific topics. The first one on maritime, which will be quite important regarding exports in the next years. And the other one is also regarding the bulk storage. As of course, we know that we want to get rid of using fossil fuels, but this means that we need to produce massively hydrogen, but we won't be able to use all this hydrogen produced. That means we will have to need bulk storage over time. And here we also see that's a new domain. And also there are some regulation codes and standards to be put in place. Next slide, please. So regarding certification, which is the topic for today, we've discussed that almost 3 or 4 years ago. But before working on certification, the first point, if we want really to ensure transparency and credibility, because that's also the main driver for hydrogen economy, we need to demonstrate to hydrogen users that the hydrogen clean, what we call clean hydrogen, is really clean and is really good for the environment, but also for economy. So for both of them. So that's why everybody was speaking about clean hydrogen, but nobody was agreeing what was clean hydrogen. And that's why we say, first, let's work on agree, at least to find a consensus on a methodology for calculating these greenhouse gas emissions when considering hydrogen production. And that was the first step, hydrogen production. But of course, what is the most important for the user is what is the cleanness, I would say, of the hydrogen when it arrives at his delivery point. And that's why we also decided to include not only the hydrogen production, but in second and third step, to also consider the transportation of hydrogen up to the delivery point. And as hydrogen may be used through different, either pure hydrogen or different carriers, then of course we have also to consider these different hydrogen carriers, as we call hydrogen conditioning and conversion. And this gives, I would say, that three main chapters of this hydrogen production analysis task force activity. So the first, next slide, please. So we published in 21 the first document only focusing on production, and for last COP 27, then we released the second chapter dealing also with conditioning of hydrogen carriers. And here you have the list of the different hydrogen production pathways. So you may see that we did not consider all the pathways, but we considered the most relevant one, at least from the government point of view. And also regarding conditioning, here liquefaction, ammonia, and LOHC, but there might be some others in the future. And we aim at finalizing the transportation part by this first quarter. And what is also most important, as IPHE is not international standardization organization, so it's not in the remit of IPHE to create standards, because usually people are using standardization as they are not really, I would say, legitimate to produce this kind of standards. So that's why we have transferred that work to ISO, the Technical Committee 187 Hydrogen Technologies. And I just encourage now people to interested in to contact their national mirror committee to be nominated as one of the experts of that specific working group. Next slide, please. And now, as this work has been now transferred to ISO, and normally we should provide a technical specification by end of this year, and as mentioned previously for COP28, and to have an international standard one year later. So now the next step is also to work on certification mechanism. And that's why at IPHE, we have created that specific task force. And the objective is, of course, not to redo or to duplicate what is already existing, but maybe to focus maybe more on regarding existing clean hydrogen certification initiatives, also to propose what will be the minimum requirements to be provided for any certification mechanism in order to be validated, and we use the word recognized mutually by different countries. But at the end, as it has been said previously, governments will validate certification mechanisms. So they have to be approved. And that's why we need really to know what are the minimum information to be provided in order to say, yes, this certification mechanism is valid, also to be taken in account in our own country. And this will be the main purpose of this certification mechanism task force. And as mentioned, we will not only focus on carbon footprint, but also on sustainability and also on just transition. So different aspects will have to be discussed, and then I would say work together with different entities. And regarding different entities, next slide, please. You may know that there are now many different hydrogen initiatives of the world. 20 years ago, when IPHE has been created, IPHE was the only one working on hydrogen, but now you see there are many different organizations dealing with hydrogen, and that's great, because it just shows that hydrogen is now quite high on many agenda. But now it's very important to coordinate all these activities. And here I would like to take the opportunity to speak on this breakthrough agenda, which initiative which has been launched during COP26 in Glasgow, so last year, 2 years ago. And the idea is really to coordinate, and a specific, next slide, please. And different countries have agreed to, to back hydrogen actions. And here you can see the 5 different actions on hydrogen. And the first one is to accelerate development of hydrogen standards. and including regulations, standards, and certification. And it has been agreed that IPHE will lead that H.1 priority action with collaboration with IEA's Hydrogen TCP, with IRENA and other entities. And so here we really now want to put in place some specific actions in order to be able to deliver for next COP28 some concrete advancements in order to say how can we now put in place common or at least mutually recognized regulations and mutually recognized certificates. And next slide, please. I try to stay on time. I think as concluding remarks, I think it's quite crucial now to say that we need to coordinate. And we've seen with different entities presented previously, everybody wants to put in place some hydrogen initiatives, some hydrogen standards, hydrogen certification. Everybody is speaking about hydrogen has to become a commodity, which means able to have some international exchanges. But first, we need to agree on terminology and then on standards regarding production, but also safety. And we need also to agree on certification. So in order really to ensure that the users are really confident and trust that the hydrogen now they're using is really beneficial to decarbonize our society while also creating a new economy. And from that point of view, international collaboration is very key. And the idea here is, as it is in OECD workshop, I would just encourage any OECD member, already member, as a country member of IPHE, to join our work or to join other initiatives like ARENA, for instance, or Hydrogen Council, that we can work together, coordinate, and at the end, we are the most efficient as possible. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Laurent, for that great overview. And I think given the number of initiatives that you've just presented to us, you've certainly given us food for thought on how to avoid overlaps and coordination. And I think you also partly answered already a question that Axel raised in the chat earlier today on, who's qualified to issue the certificate. So I hope we can continue those discussions after the presentation. But so give me the perfect setup to pass it on to Axel for his presentation. And thanks again for stick on time 7 minutes so we can have a conversation after. Your turn, Axel. Thank you.
Good. Thanks, Geraldine. And thank you for the opportunity here to speak with you. Actually, I'm a little bit exotic, I guess, if you don't see so much slides about guarantee of origin and all that stuff, but there are some other things. Maybe the next slide will show you that I only took one sentence of this concept note we already know, and that's the safety and conformity may be also covered in certification schemes. And you will, maybe I introduce DNV a little bit in upfront, and then we are going to one example how we deal with that. So next slide, you will see what DNV is. We are close to 160 years in the globe and working with more than 12,000 employees worldwide. And maybe you are rethinking why an innovation and digitalization manager is talking to you today. So we are spending more than 5% of our annual revenue into renewable, into research and development, sorry. And you can see we are coming from ship and offshore classification. That's maybe you are knowing us, and you see also in the background of me that we are talking about ammonia as one fuel for vessels. I'm located in the energy advisory certification since more than 25 years, and we will have an example from the wind into hydrogen in a few seconds. And of course, we are also talking about digitalization, how we can, for instance, proceed with blockchain, such certificates at the end. The next slide, I will go deeper into that, what we are doing. I'm located in renewable certification, and that's more than 230 people working in 10 offices worldwide, and we will bring up 2 or 3 offices today, this year as well. We are working 95% in certification of renewable assets, and that's why we are also actively have more than 40 different standards or service specification recommended practice out for that. And why I'm telling you that is 2 or 3 years ago, I was approached about you did a very global acknowledged certification scheme for wind turbines for such an assets. Why not using that also now for hydrogen? And then I thought, okay, that might be a good idea. Let's have a chat with our customers, and that's all the stakeholders actually. Now for the next JIP, on the next slide, you will see that we made a joint industrial project, we called it, and we are knowing that a lot of different standards are already there for designing such hydrogen plants, and the safety aspects are maybe also already acknowledged in oil and gas applications. And some of the developers are asking us, oh, how is the quality, how is the performance of such a hydrogen production plant? And at the end, last year, we started with that, we started with that JIP, and you see here the partners. And additionally, last week, we announced on LinkedIn that we now have also one bank with Societe Generale and also one insurance company like Swiss Re into our JIP. So we got a lot of different views on it. So it is not only the electrolyzer manufacturers who deal with that kind of standard after a while. It's more about how is the bankability, how that can be insurance. We are looking actually, and that's maybe a motivation for you, for authorities who are keen to understand how this JIP or this outcome might be a standard at the end, a global acknowledged one, how we can deal with that. And yeah, here it's more about these red colored design regulation, safety aspects we are dealing with. And in the next slide, you will see, or you have already seen, that it is totally complex. Also here, if we are going into the assets, not going into certification of the colors or however clean hydrogen. And I only gave you a small aspect of hydrogen production, but transportation, storage, feedstock, all that kind of things, and nothing else to do also with ammonia. We have to tweak again to our knowledge. And what we are doing in DNV is we are the enablers. So we can bring them together on one table, think about it, make maybe a standard out of that so that everybody, at least on that table, acknowledge on that. And afterwards, we have a hearing, and I invite you all to that in 3 months' time, when the standard for hydrogen production system will be out, that you can comment and give us some good thoughts about how we can tweak it even better. So when I'm coming back to the 3 questions we have already had, so I saw already the stakeholders are the end users, steel, concrete, maybe chemical industry, the authorities, the developers, manufacturers of such plants, but also the banks and insurance and authorities are totally important. So we need all of them. And all stakeholders on that, and how the governments can be improved in that. I think on one hand it's bankability and insurance, so the market will drive us forward to that. But I'm happy if the authorities of all the countries and all the institutions have a good understanding how we can come together and make these energy transformation available very fast. So I took only 6 minutes, then it's good to have some more minutes to discuss it in a few seconds. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Axel, for being on time and also covering some key issues. And I think you really highlighted the need for public-private coordination. I must say at the OECD, this is something we've been doing for over 12 years on, bridging the gap between investors, other private actors and market participants and governments and public actors on the broader transition to a low carbon economy. And I think specifically on green hydrogen, there's a value here that maybe we can discuss later. Let me turn to Tudor for his presentation to complement the views. And I think we have a range of stakeholders here represented in that session. So Tudor, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Geraldine, for a nice, kind introduction. So I'm trying to be very, very quick about what's happening in France. So my presentation will be about the legal framework around hydrogen certification. If you can pass the next slide, please. So here you have a very brief background with what happened in the last, let's say, 15, 20 years in France, and the amount of, let's say, public investment, mainly into R&D. And also the past 5 years, since 2018, when the first hydrogen strategy was published in France. which was followed by the Energy and Climate Law in 2019, which was actually the first step for the hydrogen legal framework, since it gave to the government, empowered the government to issue an ordinance and a decree let's say to put into place the framework for support mechanism and certification and definitions for hydrogen, which was then followed what happened in Europe with the German hydrogen strategy and European hydrogen strategy in September 2020. There was a new, let's say, revised national strategy for renewable and low carbon hydrogen development in France, which was the main fact in this was the, let's say, the public finance, the public investments, which was up to 7 billion euros, which was also increased last year to 9 billion euros in total. Next slide, please. So what happened? What happened exactly? Well, in February 2021, there was the publication of the hydrogen ordinance, where we found the hydrogen definitions, clear definitions, the traceability for renewable and low carbon hydrogen framework, the support mechanism for decarbonized hydrogen, and traceability for renewable gas fed into the natural gas grid, and of course everything that concerns the other part of the chain value, such as the safety of person and good for the gas grid, and some measures related to the hydrogen bulk underground storage. Next slide, please. So everything was done, of course, with constant consultation of the stakeholders, and what was, let's say, the consensus that was found out that there was a strong will for the consumers to have a physical traceability when feasible, and for the producers willing to avoid, let's say, to transport or distribution hydrogen infrastructure. So that was what was coming out on this part. Also, the stakeholders put forward the technology neutrality, and also, as already mentioned, regulatory aspects such as safety, town planning rules, technical control, vehicles control, market training and skills, and everything that is always on discussion today. There were several working groups that have to be set in order to deal with this issue, and they are ongoing. So what the results of these consultations for the hydrogen ordinance were? Please, the next slide, please. Were bring us to these definitions, because everybody was asked government to have a simple set of definitions which respects technology neutrality, and here you go. And I think that France is the only country in the world that has definitions for the hydrogen. But first of all, what is hydrogen in the French law? Hydrogen is actually the dihydrogen molecule under a certain degree of purity, which I think most likely would be fuel cell quality in France, at least. And then we have renewable hydrogen, which is hydrogen produced from renewable energy sources, as they are defined in the Renewable Energy Directive, but with a greenhouse gas footprint below a certain threshold. And we'll come to that a little bit later, why I was speaking about greenhouse gas footprint for renewable. There is low carbon hydrogen, which has only have to be below the greenhouse gas footprint threshold. And then high carbon hydrogen, everything that is above the threshold, regardless of the primary energy sources used to produce that hydrogen. The threshold still remains to be defined, but most likely would be aligned with the taxonomy and the proposals and the red revision. So it'll be around 3.4 kilogram of CO2 equivalent per kilogram of hydrogen. There are also some let's say rules concerning the byproduct hydrogen that never goes out of the process that generates him. which is the case for the hydrogen in the refineries. So there is a amount of hydrogen that actually never goes out of the refinery. It is produced on one hand and then used for desulfurization. And this hydrogen is not accounted in the national targets and is not accounted in any kind of hydrogen-related policy in France. And then one of the most important thing is the life cycle analysis used in France, which is some, let's say, scope 3 from well to gate, that's why you see a greenhouse gas footprint even for renewables, because they are renewable, they are not zero actually. There is an embedded greenhouse gas footprint, but also a direct emissions when it comes to thermal processes of biomass degradation, for example. So there is a greenhouse gas footprint for the main, let's say, pathways of production today, steam methane reforming and water electrolysis, whether PEM or alkali. And everything is written in the national carbon greenhouse footprint database, which is operated by the French Environment and Energy Management Agency. Well, clearly, someone that wants to produce hydrogen and is happy with the greenhouse gas footprint in that database, they just use this value. They don't need to carry life cycle analysis. They just are taking this value, and this national database is also used when, let's say, decrees or decisions by government are, let's say, setting thresholds. The reference is this national carbon database. Next slide, please. And then now we are going to traceability. I saw that there was say, okay, there's a difference between traceability and certification, which is true. But when you are talking about let's say the origin or what was used to produce that hydrogen and what is the greenhouse gas footprint of that hydrogen, well, we may still talk about traceability. So the idea is to have only one book with two options for renewable and low carbon hydrogen. And there is a traceability guarantees, that is physical traceability, or in other words, the mass balance principle. Well, in France, for the time being, there is somewhere between identity preservation and mass balance, since we do not allow the mixing of renewable with low carbon or any kind of mixes of the hydrogen. And then you have the book and claim principle, as you know it for electricity, the guarantees of origin. There is no full disclosure this time, but there's possible to make it happen in the future. So let's say any hydrogen consumer has its free choice between traceability guarantees and guarantees of origin. And what is most important for those that are consuming 100% high carbon hydrogen, it's clearly that they cannot use the guarantees of origin to greenwash that high carbon consumption, and they have to, let's say, to say at some point that they are actually consuming high carbon hydrogen. So we are very attentive on that. Next slide, please.
Tudor, thank you so much. And so sorry, can I encourage you to wrap up so we can have a short conversation afterwards? Okay. I'm sorry, thank you so much. It's so the last speakers.
Okay, thank you. So what is let's say rather new is that for the guarantees of origin for hydrogen in France, the greenhouse gas footprint is mandatory, because you were speaking about some standards. There is a standard related to the guarantees of origin, European standard. Next slide, please. Next slide, because this is actually what was happening. So the main message is, the key message is that France remains committed to apply the rules of the physical reality. So it's the physics that are making the law, not the law that are making the physics. Then the rules and criteria for hydrogen certification must be aligned with the most ambitious ones. So if somebody or some other country has more ambitious criteria, then France will follow, but not the other way. France has its own hydrogen certification mechanism, and it is the government which is behind that and which does the verification. This is very important. And France also will keep looking very carefully of everything that that concern the voluntary schemes and their recognition, and most importantly, France's commitment against any kind of form of greenwashing is and has always been at its energy policy. Thank you very much, and yeah, I'm open for your question. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tudor, and thanks for reminding us that while international harmonization is very critical, we also need to ensure that we don't lower down the stringency of certain national circumstances. So thanks for reminding that. And I think it's a thin balance that we see not just in green hydrogen, but across sustainable finance issues globally these days. There were a few questions that I noted throughout the webinar that I wanted to ask the three of you. So one of them was someone asked in the chat earlier that good governance requires high levels of and standards for transparency, for accountability. How can we develop or explore open data standards? And that's something that I want to put it out there in the context of, you know, fragmentation of the market and the need for harmonization and the issue of compliance, verification for high quality data. So what's the role of stakeholders there for possible open data standards? I don't know whether maybe Laurent or Tudor, you want to take that one. And Axel, I wanted to ask you specifically a question on how do we make public-private partnership work, you know, across the global trade value chains. So I don't know if you want to pick.
Maybe I can just say that, yes, transparency is key. So that's why we need to be as transparent as possible to create confidence. And I think data have to be open. And that's why it has been even presented in previous presentation that more or less when you are delivering some hydrogen, you may have some identity cards of this hydrogen you are delivering. And for instance, the example provided by Prerna from Australia government was quite clear. You need to be able to show to your customer how you produce the hydrogen, what the energy you've used, how it has been transported, and also just for the carbon footprint approach. And this has to be accessible. And that's why it is so key to ensure that not only values are open, but the methodology, how these values have been calculated, considering what was the system boundary considered, and what are the assumptions considered. This has to be really transparent and provided to all the consumers that you and me, if needed, we may recalculate based on this assumption and to ensure that the values were right. So this is, I would say, quite key, but methodology, common methodology and well-defined methodologies, if they are different, are really key before, I would say, accepting any values.
Thank you so much. Tudor, 30 seconds. 30 seconds.
I'll push this even further. It has to be transparent, also trustworthy, and verification is the key to that. And how can I put this? This is a key factor, and for transparency is the obligation, or let's say the dissemination. For example, for the electricity, I never saw any kind of electricity supplier that puts on your bill what were the guarantees of origin that he used when he signed the contract with you. This is I never saw that. And also there is this confusion that the guarantees of origin are actually guarantees that you are actually consuming that renewable electricity, which is not true. So this confusion, as long as this persists, I cannot see how we can speak about transparency and trustworthiness. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Axel, 30 seconds on either that question or the public-private partnership coordination.
Yeah, actually, we are in a luxury situation, and we are approached from many different regions or also different stakeholders, and that's maybe we should make it more public. That's what I see now again. So take all the channels you have and say, hey, here is something we can collaborate together, and together that's the main reason. And as I mentioned earlier, so I think the authorities, they should be sit on one table together, because electricity, all that energy is political to some extent. And of course, if they agree on a rough frame, then we can follow on that. But we should also be active now and not waiting for that.
Thank you, Axel.
On the public side, yes, on the public side, I fully agree. As I have shown in my slide, there are many hydrogen initiatives all over the world, many different entities. It's great on one hand seeing that, okay, everyone is interested in hydrogen, but if we want to be efficient, we need really to be coordinated. And that's why I would more suggest people to work together and I would say going into already existing initiatives more than try to create new ones. And the idea is all these public entities are open for collaboration with anyone. And just I'm speaking on behalf of IPHE, we are very happy to collaborate with any country connected with IPHE or even beyond, in order to ensure that we are speaking on the public side in a coordinated way.
Thank you so much, Laurent, and thank you, Tudor and Axel. As a concluding, I'd say 30-second remarks from each of you. I will ask you one final question is, there's a range of initiative, and given OECD's critical role as a standard setter and convener and fostering dialogue across economic issues, where do you see the value that the OECD could play in enhancing dialogue and coordination on hydrogen certification and the broader issue of hydrogen? And for example, on financing, since it's a core expertise of the OECD, is there any view you would say that we could help without duplicating efforts from other initiatives? And I will thank you for staying short so we can wrap up.
Maybe if I start, I was mentioning breakthrough agenda. And if you see on this hydrogen action, there are different aspects. Regulation, but the H.2 is on finance. So here also, I think if OECD members are interested, they can also contribute to this H.2 initiative under the breakthrough agenda. And this is also open today for any country interested in. So if you're interested in, just either contact directly Breakthrough Agenda Secretariat or contact myself and I will forward information.
Thanks, Laurent. Tudor and Axel, back to you. Not just an OECD member country, but also the OECD as an organization across the Secretariat, if you have any views there.
I can agree on Anthony. So they should come early on the table, and they, if the invitation Anthony Laurent already mentioned, please go now into that, and we need fresh ideas, because otherwise the industrial will take the lead, and that's maybe not the case, or not the good case in any time, in any case. So
yeah, so it's clear that duplication and redundancy are counterproductive, and moreover, I just add that also it doesn't build the trust. Like, what is this? 10,000 of initiatives on hydrogen. Who do believe? So also it's a part of trustworthiness and transparency, and this is very important. And I just might add, perhaps Laurent couldn't say it itself. Also, IPHE remains open to any country that wants to join. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tudor, Axel, and Laurent, raising the idea to come early at the table for all OECD member countries so that catch up the train and the dialogue sets up early. I've heard a lot of good insights from all of you. So I want to thank you all. I'm going to close that session. And before passing it out to Dare and Joseph, let me just thank Joseph, Dare, Joanna, Dominique, and Charlotte for organizing such a great webinar. I've learned a lot. It was very interesting. So thank you all very much for listening and staying beyond time. And let me close the session now.
Thank you, Geraldine.
Thank you all.
So just to wrap up today's discussions and a few concluding remarks. First of all, thank you, Joanna, for organizing this event together with Joseph. And of course, to Charlotte and Dominique for the coordination of today's event. And the speakers as well, obviously, they've provided us with the most recent and insightful information. And as our Deputy Director at the very beginning has explained, hydrogen is a new area for the OECD. We've started with the financing and enabling conditions discussion for green hydrogen and in emerging and developing economies. And this is obviously our strength, but there's obviously many areas which we can link our work with. And I hope that we will follow up on this with all the participating organizations and countries to today's discussion. Now, what we heard in a very short summary, there's a large number of projects in the pipeline that are being developed, but it actually is the growth is lower than what it should be happening, and the demand, regulation, and infrastructure uncertainties are the main barriers to that. And we try to look on the demand and regulation side from the perspective of certification, what should be included in the certification mechanisms, and how the interoperability and the harmonization of those certification mechanisms should be enabled and we paid special attention to the role of stakeholders for that. I think all speakers have mentioned the importance of treating hydrogen with its value chain, which came as a complex issue, and not only applicable to the hydrogen itself, but also the challenges are pertaining to the products that are derived from hydrogen, such as steel and so on. So for the harmonization part, we are, I think, in agreement that the higher level agreement is easy, but we need to do a bit of deeper level and more detailed level agreement, harmonization of the certification mechanisms. So while we do that, we need to develop well-established mechanisms in detail, but at the same time, speakers have mentioned the limitation on to limit over-regulation, especially in the early creation of the hydrogen market. And speaking and going back to the value chain level harmonization will also be needed. For that, flexibility, adaptability to overcome complexity are perhaps the two keywords. Definitions and standards, data and methodology, alignment on all these fronts are a must. I think many of the speakers, and during the poll, it was also mentioned the life cycle approach. So not only the cradle to grave, but also the life cycle emissions based on internationally recognized methodologies, and transparency and full disclosure are also other characteristics that have been mentioned. It's obviously not an issue of only emissions. The broader sustainability criteria, just transition aspects, development aspects are all key. And it's not only the certification itself, but it's also the transparency, accountability, enforcement, tracking, business models, enable conditions. These were the highlights that we've heard today from the Irene-RMI joint report. Another interesting insight as I close is to understand a little bit the details of the large off-taker agreements that are being developed. So understands what their characteristics are, what are they looking like, and it's not only what the customer is requiring, but also what the producer is supplying and how these two are able to meet. A final point on the characteristics came concerning the power system implications of hydrogen production. Additionality concerns and how these address the carbon impacts. And this is also an area we are trying to understand better in view of our partner countries from emerging and developing economies. Perhaps our next webinar will elaborate on these issues. So the summary of today's discussion alongside its recording will be available in some days on our webpage. As mentioned, this is the first in a series of webinars that we are organizing throughout this year on hydrogen, but also in the broader context of industry sector decarbonization. So more will come in the coming months, and we very much look forward to following up on this discussion with you and developing joint work in the future with your partners and the government. So thank you very much again, and I wish you a good day, a good afternoon, or a good evening.